Hello, hello, hello! If you can hear or see us or any of that stuff, please let us know. And I've also just realized that I don't have the chats open, but whatever, it's fine. Hopefully you're all doing well today.
Praag.
Andy and I are both facing off with our own version of the Chaos Taint trying to work its way through from Prague to us, but we're managing. We're here.
Quite. The affliction of Prague has certainly struck me this morning. I woke up thinking, oh, today's going to be a great day. But my body went, nope, it's time to go back to sleep, Andy. So I only woke up about 45 minutes ago, which might not sound like it's that early to any of you out there, but that's 3:15 in the afternoon that I woke up. So I'm kind of like, hi, hello, I'm 100% here, completely with it. So yeah, it's going to be a fun one.
I had a very similar awakening where it's like, oh man, I have Lorebeards and I should get up and eat something. And then I laid there for, I think, another 30 minutes.
I think that is the only right and proper way to start your day on a Sunday. So that all aside, today's going to be a fun topic. It's Prague. This subject is slightly personal for me because it's a place that I have mapped for Games Workshop. And I kind of love this place. It's an example of one of the many cursed cities in Warhammer. And it's, I think, one of the most famous examples and stood as a model for other cities that Games Workshop would create long after Prague that would be somewhat tainted or cursed or some equivalent word.
Yeah, and Prague has a really critical place in a lot of the Warhammer history, especially for those of you that have a roleplay background. Prague has certainly had its moments and has done a pretty fun job of carrying forward a lot of its more, you'll see, but some of its more crazy things that theoretically are lurking beneath the city that may raise eyebrows are still around. There are some elements of some old Hammer still lurking there, which is fun and gives the city like kind of a unique identity. But it also, one of the things that I love so much about it is it does such a good job of showcasing the dangers of chaos in a very like, even if you were to survive against the chaos invasion and come back afterwards, it shows why things will never be the same in a really good way.
Yeah, agreed completely. This is, from my perspective, as you'll notice when we eventually dive into the intro, this is a city that has a great depth of history for Games Workshop, where it does go right from, as Sotek says, the old Hammer into the new Hammer, and eventually, as is often the case with our descriptions, into the end times where things go boom. So it really does run almost the gamut of Warhammer's experience, and its original version and how it's pitched slowly changed down through the editions until we get our modern iteration. But unlike many things that Games Workshop has repitched, revisioned, reimagined in different ways, Prague stays pretty much the same throughout. Details are added and the exact specifics change over time, but the core of what the city is never does change. So yeah, it's going to be a fun one, this one, I think.
Yep. And so before we get right into it, I'll go ahead and knock out all the little like super chats and stuff that have come in right before we got started, and then we will be off to the races.
Off to the races.
Darius, I had the weirdest dream that Gotrek and Felix were in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and met Buffy and Giles, plus Snorri killed Xander after a drinking contest because he was annoying. How would Giles and Buffy get along with Gotrek, Felix, and Snorri?
It's Giles. It's Giles.
Sorry, Giles.
And how would they get along with them? You know what? Probably surprisingly well. Giles, I mean, they're characters, even if there were Warhammer equivalents who would absolutely fit into that pulpy tone that Gotrek and Felix have. So yeah, I think they fit in really well, Darius. I think it would be fun, and indeed, the writer of the Prague part of Realms of the Ice Queen wrote bits for the Buffy game as well. So there you go.
Oh, there you go, a match made in heaven.
Yeah, totally.
There is. Are there any other good guy steppe nomads besides the Ungles and the Ropesman tribes? I know GW likes the scary Mongol trope, but it would be nice to have some steppe tribes that are more peaceful, like the Tuvan people.
Yeah, no. There's a lot of dead tribes, which occasionally get resurrected here or there. Even when we were doing Realm of the Ice Queen, the Ropsmen were dead. And we pretty much said, no, they're not. And there's a Ropsman ghetto, for example, sitting inside the city of Prague. This formed part of the initial conversations that we had about how we were going to do our version of Kislev when we were writing the Realm of the Ice Queen book. There's a bunch of emails that winged between the authors. So the authors were myself, Steve Darlington, David Chart, and Graham McNeil. Graham McNeil had been brought in because he'd written the Ambassador Chronicles relatively recently, which are a group of novels following the Ambassador, who's most definitely the Imperial Ambassador, pardon me, Empire's Ambassador to Kislev's court, who definitely isn't Sean Connery. And definitely not Sean Connery, and all the details of Kislev that had been added to those books were a core component of what we were going to be writing about. So him being involved was an obvious choice. And we were discussing the various tribes, and Graham, who had worked in the studio very recently at that point, was of the opinion we shouldn't have any of them because the studio's opinion was they're dead and gone completely. And the details of Ropsman and such like were brought up because they'd been mentioned here or there in other sources. And he went, no, we could use the Ropsman. They could go, and we were like, excellent, right, let's make sure they're in. Woohoo! So they got added into Prague and proliferated into a book here or there. But sadly, from this perspective, the answer is largely no. You'll find that there is references to many other tribes of the steppe, for example, often just real world names copy pasted over by various authors. For example, if you go into Riders of the Dead by Dan Abnett, he makes lots of references to the Scythian tribes that used to exist in the area, which are just a copy paste from real life. Also, there's many references to centaur tribes that were kicking around in the area as well. And those centaur tribes were the source of the Kislevite winged lancers. And that's a very weird story. Sometimes it's winged horses, sometimes it is not. It's winged centaurs, pardon me. But broadly speaking, there isn't other human tribes in the area. And I think that's a bit of a shame. That is pretty much the Ungals who are there. Occasionally down the south, the Frykings are mentioned here or there, south of Kislev, that is, but not that much more. And I think it is, given the size of the place and also the amount of space we have on the other side, which we know because of the old world, was ruled over by Kislev for a long time then as well. If I was redoing the Kislev book and I had absolute creative control, I would be adding more. And indeed, adding things like, say, for example, the Tuvan people, or an equivalent, things that we can look at and say, what could we add to add a lot of fun local ethnic detail. And ethnic detail is something that Warhammer writers in the past have often gone, we don't need this because it adds too much complication.
Yeah, I will say that either with the upcoming old world roleplay game or just in whenever Kislev gets their full-on army book, I agree with Andy that I really hope they dive more into it, especially because Kislev is like tripling in size for the old world. Like, it's huge. It practically has a road connecting straight to Grand Cathay, which means it is just beyond massive, which is awesome because there's going to be so many more people. So hopefully that's something they do. I wouldn't bet on it. That's not usually their go-to strategy, but, you know, hope for the best.
Yep, agreed completely.
Laughing God, I've always liked Prague. What are some good hooks or ideas for roleplay that would be excellent for exploring the city? Any dealing with the curse pirates? There's a lot. We're actually going to talk about quite a few of them because a lot of them have to do with the legacy of Prague. And like, especially like in the older lore, like the fact that there may or may not, depending on who you believe, be a god beneath the city, according to some folk. But there's a lot of things going on in the city, especially because quite a few novels make references to Prague or take place. Obviously, Gotrek and Felix has 2 books that feature very heavily in Prague, between Beast Slayer and the opening parts of Vampire Slayer. There's so much going on in Prague. And any place where you have a significant chaos influence, you have quite literally infinite roleplay hooks, because something is always bubbling away somewhere in the city that's going to threaten to wipe them all out if it's not dealt with. Whether it's shenanigans, one of the gods, or it's undead related, because we'll talk about Prague has a big undead population, contrary to what you may suspect. A lot of vampires in Prague. But there's a lot to do. But we'll get into that as we go.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. That Prague is an adventurer city for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. There are a few places in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that feel like they're set up for playing in, and in this case Prague is one of them, very much one of them. It's a place that is a confluence of peoples, where we have east meets west in a single location, but that single location itself is also cursed. So we have basically rotten roots, bad guys of all different kinds. We have high politics and low politics. We have ghettos and ogres and halflings and different tribesmen from across the world. It's a lovely melting pot of different peoples, and an isolated bastion as well, meaning that you can have it attacked by various horrible forces, much like, for example, happens in the Gotrek and Felix novels as well. It's just one of those locations that is not just really cool because of the way it's described, but it's one that, if you look into your Warhammer lore, has been there almost since the beginning and used again and again and again, often for high adventure and often of the pulpy kind. So this city is basically one gigantic adventure hook waiting to happen, and we will be covering that as we go on.
Yep. Sean Schultz, what about this idea with Marvel starting to work on 40K comics? Yeah, that's been going around a lot. Disney owns Marvel, therefore would the Chaos Gods be Disney princesses? Yes, obviously, of course. And Nurgle is the prettiest princess of them all. Laughing God, idea for Warhammer Quest Cursed City game for the old world. Make it set in the aftermath of the Siege of Prague. That would be super fun. I'd be very down for that. I will say I really hope that would be great, because I love the Cursed City board game. It is super fun. Literally, its only downside is that setting up each match takes longer than it should, because you have to get all the tiles in the right place. But once you get good at it, it's actually not that bad. But Cursed City was a blast. I played through the entire game. I would love a Prague version of that that's set in the aftermath. That'd be great. I also hope they bring back More Time, because More Time is actually relatively relevant in the old world timeline, because Magnus hasn't raised it to the ground yet. He's about to, but he hasn't got there yet.
Yep, agreed.
Lich Lord Chris, after all the emotional damage from yesterday, I was able to make it to today's stream. Thanks, Sotek. You're welcome. You deserved everything that I said. JF, hi, guys. Watch the R-Ball stream and love tearing down Prague and Kislev in Total War now. Love listening to you guys bring all of my games more alive. Oh, well, that's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Don't worry. Prague's in for a whole nother round of more of the same.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Biofoot ran a TTRPG through the Siege of Prague, and they weren't able to save it despite committing no errors. Great setting for Never Stop Blowing Up.
Yeah. It's a fun one. I've also used this city quite a lot in my role-playing games. I've run the Siege of Prague, where Azavar Kul, one of the Ever-Chosen, sacks the place. I've also run a game that was based on Arik Demonclaw's attack of the place, which was super fun because Gotrek and Felix kicking around there too. So that's one that was held back. It's a location that's, as I say, been used by so many books that it's very easy to use it in your games if you wish to do so, because there are so many climatic battles that take place in and around the city. So yeah, good stuff.
Ryan Jones, I'm gore sad. You skipped over gore bad. Hey, I mean, y'all voted. I will say, I was genuinely shocked by the results. I thought it was going to be closer. Prague obliterated everything else, which is not what I thought was going to happen. Which, hey, kudos to y'all. Y'all still surprised us. That was the Omen Lord I was most looking forward to. Will you cover him in the near future? Yeah, we'll cover him pretty soon. I would say it probably won't be that long. It's likely he would be the next, when we decide we want to do greenskins, he would be the next greenskin thing.
Yeah, it does seem very likely.
Platinum Killer was out of the country for my wedding. Well, congratulations.
Congratulations. Woo!
Almost said like happy getting hitched. I don't know. Missed the last couple shows. If Arbol was defeated, turned to a spawn, the spawn then killed his killer. Would Arbol revert back? No, sadly, Spawndom is a one-way trip. Yeah, you are a discarded toy by the Dark Gods. They are not going to pay attention to you anymore. Happy belated birthday. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Elemental Exposure. Do they play the Bohemian Rhapsody in Prague? Sure. Why not? Sinchmeister, has anyone ever been chucked through a window in Prague? Yes, many times.
He's
Many
demonstrated.
times.
Mm-hmm.
I would say absolutely yes.
Are we ready?
Yes, I believe it is time to get into it.
Alrighty, let's start off with a fun wee intro. Before I do, as always, we will be taking our super chats that come in batches, much like we've just done. If you are new to watching us discussing Warhammer lore, we will be diving deep into the subject of the day, Prague, and any super chats will be taken in batches as we progress, because we've got quite a lot to say about this particular city. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this stream, Prague is, for me, a city that has a very long history for me personally. I first became aware of it as a location inside, I think it was Citadel Compendium number 3, where we had the Caleb Dark comics. And this is one of the core details that the city will never lose. And in there, we get the story of Caleb Dark, a follower of Malal, a 5th chaos god that gets kind of ditched because the creators of the comic owned the stuff that they created that wasn't already Games Workshop, and they never really licensed it or gave it to Games Workshop because things worked differently back then. Games Workshop wasn't this big overarching company that whenever you worked for them you signed over all your rights. At that point you were just a creative that was working within it, meaning that the somewhat crazed storyline that they had where there was a goddess trapped underneath the city of Prague and you needed to collect crystal keys to unlock said goddess was always theirs. So this goddess, a goddess of law that would later be picked up into the roleplay game, Arianka, wasn't really owned by Games Workshop, meaning that this great goddess that lived beneath the city that I was reading about in a comic, go check it out yourself if you can find a digital copy on somewhere. It's proper crazy old Warhammer. Never really became a thing in Games Workshop. But this story of a god of law, as in someone who stands against the chaos powers, being trapped beneath Prague, became a core storyline for loads of games of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay across the country because it was just such a cool idea. The idea that there was this goddess that could be freed underneath the city of Prague, this great cursed city that had been absolutely leveled by the great hordes of chaos some 200 years earlier. And underneath this cursed city was this goddess that you could somehow free. So for all Games Workshop, never really touched it again. When Graham Davis came to writing the very small write-up for the Gods of Law that sat inside Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, he took the existing ones that were already there, Arianka and Illuminus, I believe, and he added one more, Salkin, who was just as Graham very happily was just Solomon Kane. He took Solomon Kane, the witch hunter, and said, Solomon Kane, added them together and went, there's my new god, because there was no gods of law other than that at that point. So he took the 2 existing ones that had already been mentioned in Games Workshop's lore, added another one, and that gave us our gods of law. And then they were never touched again. The gods of law as a concept were originally created by Michael Moorcock, and Games Workshop just copy-pasted them over and said, there's a great fight between chaos and law in the Warhammer world. But when the story got picked up later, the gods of law were dropped. Largely because it wasn't a core component of how Games Workshop decided they were going to do things, because they didn't own one of the goddesses that they were using. It was much easier just dropping it. And it never gets picked up from this point on by almost any writer in any publication until pretty much just like a year or so ago. So we have ourselves at the foundation point of Prague 2 important points. And that is, number 1, it is this great city in the north and their equivalent of fantasy Russia, and Prague. It's not exactly Russia, but hey, we're back in the USSR during this time, where the East is all behind the Iron Curtain when this is being written. And somewhere like Prague, as far as the often ill-educated Warhammer creators at the time, that's all Russian. So anything that was over in the East becomes Russian, even though they had their own cultural identities were in the real world equivalents. So it's this city that collapses to chaos. When the Realms of Chaos book comes out, so the very first one for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition and also Warhammer Fantasy Battle and 40k, we get ourselves a continuation of what Prague represents. And there's a lovely double-page spread story of Prague falling to chaos. I mean, it's not really. It's the old story that had already been pitched in the previous edition. And it's more of a personal story of a Kislevite guard, but it got reinforced as a core location in the north where various Russian-facing names are fighting off against chaos and they lose. There's no concept at this point of a Never Chosen or of Azavar Kul, of anything else. It's just chaos sorcerers spitting fire, poor old Russian-named individuals getting torn to shreds. A big chaos lord walks in and things are bad. And that's almost all the detail we had when we moved into the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's a city, a chaos city. No, a Kislev city that's fallen to chaos. Yeah, that's it. And maybe there's a goddess under it, maybe, but we can't really give that goddess's name because Games Workshop doesn't own it. So not a lot of detail. Now, Games Workshop had loads of maps of the area where Prague is always positioned in what was at that point the furthest northern point of Kislev. And in 2000, I'm going to guess about 2008, that scant detail. So a few mentions of White Dwarf, a few mentions in stories, a few mentions here or there about what the place was, and the fact that it had stood against chaos and collapsed and was still cursed is what we had when we sat down to write Realm of the Ice Queen. In Realm of the Ice Queen, the write-up for Kislev was largely in the hands of Steve Darlington. Now, if you don't know Steve D, he joined, I think it was just Sotek, in one of our very first streams when we were working together. So if you go over to the Lorebeards, I'm pretty sure we've got a list of all, you've got a playlist for all the episodes. Yep. So go over to the, I should know, I can edit it. So yeah, there's a playlist of all the episodes. Right near the very beginning, you'll see an interview with Steve Darlington. He was one of the writers. He was one of my co-writers. And we sat down and we had a big chin wag because there was very little detail about Prague outside of a couple of mentions in a few novels. Outside of the fact that Chaos had sacked it and it was still cursed, and the detail that we received in, say, a White Dwarf snippet or a previous story was like, the walls still scream from the horrors inflicted upon them. It didn't say who built the city. It didn't say where it came from, because it was created at a time when there were no Gospodars. There were no Ungals. There were no other tribes at all. It was created in the very early days of Games Workshop where they just copy-pasted a name from the real world, Prague, and changed its spelling. That was it. Steve D was largely left to go do his own thing after we had our discussion. Go wild. You can go wild, and Games Workshop are happy for us to do so. Before he started, made one other significant change to Kislev in this time as well. And that's that the Northern Oblast, as in the northern part of Kislev, didn't stop at Prague. Up to this point, it pretty much stopped at the river that connects Leningrad up through to Prague. And that was northern Kislev, which meant that Kislev was actually quite a small area. I pitched to Games Workshop directly when we were having the conversations as authors behind the scenes, directly that Kislev should be all of the north up to Norska. And it included the area that had been traditionally called Troll Country for a very, very long time. And that allowed us to move right up to the old passes that were up in the top right of the Kislev map. And that was seen to be very important because Gotrek and Felix had put Kislevites up there. And Gotrek and Felix's path through that area had basically extended Kislev's reach. And I got told, because Games Workshop at that point were, in terms of the lore, not adding anything new to it, had no desire to add anything new to Kislev, that I could do that. So I did, which meant that Prague changed significantly. It was no longer the northern bastion against chaos. It was now a northern bastion that fell to chaos. During the Great War against the Great War against Chaos, is that his name? My brain's going wild.
Yeah.
The Great War that happened 200 years ago, that was eventually ended by Magnus the Pious. That changes things, moves Prague slightly further to the south of, well, the midpoint of Kislev. And when Steve went in to do all of his writing, he had a slightly different pitch on it. Because it was now more of a central point, he repitched Prague from being this northern bastion held in the snows and constantly being threatened by chaos to one that was sort of in the middle and was instead a melting pot of peoples. A melting pot of peoples from the north, whether it was, say, Norse dwarves, Norse folk, all manner of Kislevite folk, may they be Ungals, Gospodars, or other tribes as well, where a new ghetto for the Ropsmen, one of the tribes that were up to this point wiped out historically, got brought back into the game and added into that particular ghetto. Cathaeans from the east and other traders from beyond that also, they were always left with a brief description of, and others, just because we are always aware that Games Workshop may add something else. An entire ogre ghetto was added over in one corner as well. And the city itself was turned from what was originally just Kislevites into this enormous crossroad where people from across the world gathered, one that was exceedingly rich, one that was exceedingly powerful, and one that, because of its central point, had grown so much in power that when it was flattened by chaos 2,200 years ago, it was not abandoned. And that was something that was very important because it had been brought in several stories, not abandoned. But at this point, cursed cities like Prague, when they fall and they're wiped out, in Warhammer lore, always get abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
You don't go near them again. Absolutely not for any reason at all. So there was some cultural reasons why it was kept. The Ungol tribe in particular, it's the core city of what used to be the center of the Ungol tribe before the Gospodars swept in and eradicated huge chunks of what used to be the Ungol. I mean, you could even call it an empire, the Ungol kingdom. The old Ungol tribe used to own this city way, way back in the day. And the Gospodars came in, kicked them in, but never truly gained the control over over Prague that they have over the cities in the south, or even Erengrad. And it becomes a source instead of national pride and rebellion. So the tone of Prague shifts significantly. It's rich, it's powerful, it's Ungol, a center of Ungol pride. It's known for its art, it's known for its craftsmanship, it's known for being the central point merchant center for all of the trade from the east, and also all of the various mines come through here, giving you various ores and metals which are transported into the city itself and converted into all sorts of great goods that are prized the world over. And this significantly changed the tone of the city from just being this abandoned fortress, strange thing in the north, to being something that had rich cultural roots that when chaos eventually comes in and flattens it, the Ungols refused to give it up. They just refused. The very stoic nature of the Kislevites that had been reinforced with books like Riders of the Dead or the Ambassador Chronicles is no matter, as is often talked in. No matter how bad things get, they come back holding a glass of kvass or kumis or something else, and they just shrug and say, well, we're just coming back in and we're going
Kislev, the walls are screaming, is no matter. Is
no matter.
It's fine.
And they refused to back down. The local Ungol hags did what they could to try and remove all of the taint that was sitting within the very stone itself. And the city was slowly but surely, over the course of decades, not just reclaimed, but entirely rebuilt. Many of the old buildings were still standing, shattered and broken, but put back together again. Because it was important that we justify why Kislev hadn't been abandoned. And it was also reinforced by how the hags got completely reworked and changed. Well, completely reworked, I made them up. How the hags were put in place where they could have powers, where they could effectively remove taint by communicating with the spirits to help them do so in turn. So it became a center of Ungol pride, thus needed to be rebuilt, had been cleansed as much as it could be, but even to this day, as we move into the modern era of Warhammer, the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, it's a cursed city where things constantly go wrong. Wizards do not like to go here because spells go wrong when they try to cast them here. The hags, who would normally dominate an area that is controlled by the Ungolls, instead prefer to live outside the city because the city itself is dangerous. There's a few that come in, but not that many. The Ice Witches shun the place completely. The great rise of political upheaval that comes with it being a center of Ungol pride has been put down by the Gospodars to the point that they no longer allow any Gospodar prince, or not Gospodar, pardon me, Ungol prince or noble to rule the place anymore. They instead appoint someone to rule Prague. So what we have is this febrile atmosphere where the politics are bloody, where the Gospodars are pretty much there as colonists, holding over the place with nobles that they appoint. And then underneath those, there is what is a sizable Ungol population, a deep upswelling of pride, and a city that is, sadly at its heart, still completely fractured and broken. But we then reach a much later, where Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 pops in and says, actually, you know that old tale of a goddess that was underneath the city, which we kind of mentioned in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2.
The girl in the glass. Yeah.
The girl in the glass who might be trapped underneath the city. It's still kind of the same. And you know how we're going to get around to this? We'll rename the goddess Arianka to the goddess Astasis.
Because she's in stasis?
I can't express how much I hate that name. She will always be, to my ears, Arianka, because that is the name that I played through, because I've rescued that goddess 3 separate times in previous games, sitting beneath the city, and they reinvigorate that old tale and place her yet again underneath that city with the crystal keys that could unlock the god, with of course the great legend attached that come the end times, this goddess will arise here. She is clearly some goddess that is of great importance to the locals who are here imprisoned for one reason in the past. And the city is reverberating with stories and tales, operas even, and ancient references to a goddess living beneath the city. And that's awesome. So what does that leave us with as we hit the modern era of Warhammer and we hit where we discussed today? We have a city that is cursed by chaos because it fell 200 years ago in the Great War against chaos. We have ourselves a goddess that lies underneath there that for one reason or another never gets set free, whether it is because of how she was put there, why she was never discovered by the chaos forces moving through. It's an odd one, but has a story that come the end times she will arise and shit will happen. It never does. Doesn't happen.
Unfulfilled prophecy at the end times? What?
Such a pain in the ass. And we have a city that is a melting pot of culture, ethnicity, peoples. There are elves, there are dwarves, there are ogres, there are halflings, there are tribes of all manner of different types. There are even tribes that we would recognize as chaos tribes, because not all chaos tribes are chaos per se. They're just people who are coming down from the north, some of whom have ditched their previous lifestyles or where they came from and have gathered in here, meaning that in the new town in particular, in the north of the city, it's just full of different peoples from different parts of the world. And that is, I think, a fascinating location, not just for us to discuss, but for us to also potentially play in if we're playing our own games of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I will end with one last thing. Man, I'm tired. That was a lot harder than it should have been.
Hey, you got through it. It was very well done. Yeah. A round of applause for Andy in the chat. You got through it.
Yeah. Wow. Although I could barely remember the Great War against Chaos. I think that says how hard I am. Excuse me while I drink more caffeine.
It's funny when you so the Astasis thing actually makes me laugh, because when they did it, they say like, okay, here's the name of the god, and then they only use Arianka for the rest of the text.
I know.
They're like, also known as Arianka. Now we're just gonna call her Arianka for the rest of this. But technically, she's Astasis, so we don't get in trouble, which I just find very funny.
She's always going to be Arianka to me. I remember reading the comic. It barely lasted at all. I think it might, again, it's been so long since I last read it. It was in the third compendium. I remember that because I remember when I bought it. And the stories just disappeared because the compendiums weren't a ongoing project that's worth mentioning. So we have the smallest mention. And it was enough that it got copy-pasted over into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. But because it was in that First Edition, and because this core story was repeated in multiple places, the girl in the glass coffin, everybody of that era pretty much played a game at some point. So that's back in the mid-80s, well, not quite mid-80s, more late 80s, early 90s, where they rescued Arianka. She became a fundamental character for almost everybody who was playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in that era, but Games Workshop did nothing with her because it wasn't really theirs. So it's fascinating to see as we move into the fourth edition, and people who remember her from back then who are now writing for the game go, yeah, I want to bring her back. And they brought her back as Arianka, but not.
10,000 ants. If you were in charge of a Warhammer dating sim, what 5 characters would you choose to put in it? Well, okay, here would be the key thing. Here would be the key thing is that A, you'd have to have like your female companions and your male companions. And B, I don't know if I would want to do special characters or custom characters. I mean, there are strengths and weaknesses to both. If you do like characters that actually exist, it'd be a lot easier. But you also would have like a little bit more restrictions. You kind of have to wiggle your way around. I would definitely have Neferata as one of them for both, for like whether your protag is male or female, Neferata would be a choice, and it would be horribly difficult.
So I have spoken to people about Games Workshop characters and discussed their favorites for a long time. And you might be surprised to learn that the vast majority of players of Warhammer prefer the male characters. And now I'm not saying that there is any inherent misogyny here or there is any gender bias of any particular type, but this appears to be the case. It might be even fair to say that some of them are almost in love with many of the male characters. The amount of obsession that sits around characters like, for example, Karl Franz, or someone like Gelt, Gelt, the Golden Dick, who deserves to just be cut in four.
He probably does. Yes, he probably has one. Yeah,
exactly. So it almost feels like if you're going to do this and stay true to the Warhammer spirit, it should just be people like Karl Franz, Boris Todbringer, Toddy, or Gelt. We should just have core Empire male characters, because that is the characters that almost every single player of Warhammer is constantly chasing anyway. So yeah, let's do that, because that would that would, I think, more accurately reflect the gaming populace.
Sarmelian Bloodweaver, Prague Garrison Total War Warhammer 3 should have a unique golem.
So I'm going to bring up a small personal story on this one. I was writing for Warhammer at the time, and I was just before I was writing the Kislev bits, and I received a heartfelt email from a Jew who was very kind, and whose father had whose father had died in Auschwitz, and to not go into all the details because it was pretty harrowing. He sat down and he said, please, for any of your writing, could you not use golems? And I said, why? And he gave me a big long thing. But basically, this is my culture, and I believe. And the golems of Prague are a core component of my own personal family history. I obviously can't tell you not to use it, but I prefer if you didn't. If you're going to make anything like that, could you instead give it a different term? Because golems are a part of my culture, my identity. And I went, well, holy shit. It was very personal, and I decided at that point I would never do this. Now, that doesn't mean that no one should ever do it, because that's other people and the choices they make. But there's always a point where you go, I don't want to be that guy. And I wasn't going to be that guy. But you're right. If we play, for example, the old, I don't know why I'm saying if we play it, but the old Vampire the Masquerade game had Jews summoning up golems there, and vampires attempting to kill them, because nobody is willing to allow the concept of a golem to settle without immediately attacking it with vampires. Obs. So I personally wouldn't do this, but I would have no problem with someone doing something similar. But there is no concept of the great Jewish diaspora doing something like this in the Warhammer world. Now, you could try and do something like the Strigony communities in the area are doing it, but it all feels a bit icky to my personal preferences. If I was doing something like this, I would probably change its tone, but possibly still do something like this, doing a different story of
I would say
an oppressed people, like maybe the Ropsmen, doing something that culturally worked for them and defending themselves from the subjugation of the Gospodars and the Ungals. So for all the Ungals are often seen as the subjugated inside Kislev society. In this particular instance, they're the subjugators. The Ungals are very much in control of Prague. So having them basically doing horrific things over towards the Ropsmen, and the Ropsmen having some sort of reply to that, I think would work really, really well. So I would be happy running on the story and the idea of it without necessarily duplicating it so obviously.
Yeah, I think taking the themes from the story and creating a unique Guardian, not just being like, oh, look, it's the Jewish golem, but having something that evokes the major themes and story beats of that particular tale would be the way to approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. Warhammer is always at its best when it is inspired by the real world rather than it copy pastes the real world. And I think that there could be a really good story in that. So yes, I agree, Sarmelian, but I would probably be a little bit more sensitive than doing exactly your suggestion.
Yeah, especially because, I mean, you want to take a story and Warhammer it up. So instead of just having the golem, making it something that is far more unique to the Warhammer world, whereas creatures like the golem are not that unique. the grand
scaling. Thanks very much for saying so, Sarmelian, in return. So yeah, thank you very much. As he just mentions there, and he has made the right call here. I think I did. I mean, the letter I received was something that I got roundly attacked for, which I thought was very odd. When I was discussing it once over in the Ratcatchers Guild, which is a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay server, where I said I wouldn't be using golems in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. This is when I was the producer for the game. I wouldn't use the term golems, but I would be having creatures that were constructs of various types, and they would have different names as and where we use them. And there was a host of people who were calling this bullshit. We can just use anything from the past and do it any way we want. And it's like, yeah, you can, but you don't have to. And in this particular instance, I felt that I didn't have to, because the people who had contacted me, I think, made a very good argument for me not to.
Yeah, well, especially because, like, then you have to, like, explain where the term comes from and, like, all these other things. And because they used to use it, and it got replaced as the setting carried on. Because I think there used to just be, like, flesh golems, but then they became the patchwork men, which is...
I remember exactly the book that elicited the letter. It was the Border Prince's book, Renegade Crowns, for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, because it had a host of random things that you could put into the Border Princedoms that you were creating, a bunch of random tables, and one of them included golems. And that was a response. The letter I received was a response to that. Now, the book was written by David Chart, but I was involved with that book as well. I'd done a bunch of maps, and I'd done a proofread on it, and done a bunch of little edity suggestions for it too. I suggested the golem was removed at that point too, and I had publicly stated it, which is why I got sent the email. I remember now.
Yep, and plus it keeps the universe more consistent. If we use terms like construct, which is a more accurate term, it also is a better catch-all, and you go, oh, it's a construct. There are rules here that apply across all these different entities, which I think just works a lot better.
And it's exactly what I suggested. We had a big conversation behind the scenes over on Black Library's forums at the time, where all the authors could gather and speak in private with each other, because there's the public-facing forums and there's the private ones. And I laid out, this is why I'm not using it. You can obviously do whatever you want, but for me, it's going to be constructs from this point forwards. And the general consensus was, yeah, that makes sense. Why would we want to do it differently?
Yeah. Which is why I'm always and plus, like, using accurate names for things helps, which is why I don't like to call them Dwarf Rune Golems. I call them Runic Guardians, because that's what they're called. They're called Runic Guardians.
Absolutely.
All right. Brian, hi, Andy. In first edition, there was an adventure called Something Rotten in Kislev for Enemy Within. Is there a reason that it was not brought back for 4th edition?
Yeah, this is slightly aside to our topic, so I'll be relatively brief on this. Something Rotten in Kislev was was added as the fourth component of the Enemy Within campaign. Arguably fifth, but yeah, the fourth part of the Enemy Within campaign, and it was created by an American author who had written a D&D version of Russia, and just turned it into the fourth part of the Enemy Within campaign. It had nothing to do with the Enemy Within. It had nothing to do with the core themes of the Enemy Within. What happened is you were going, Enemy Within, moving around the Empire, Enemy Within, Enemy Within. Oh, I'm in Middenheim, Enemy Within, Enemy Within. Kislev! And the version of Kislev that was presented inside Something Rotten in Kislev was not liked by many of the writers. And when it came round to doing the second edition version, the Realms of the Ice Queen book, that is, the Something Rotten version was almost entirely ignored. We had lots of conversations about this. Graham McNeil was the most strident for this. He was like, that book is so old and has nothing to do with Warhammer as it currently stands. So I prefer we didn't use any of this. I broadly agreed. I'd run the adventure like 4 or 5 times, and it's daft. It's just full of old Hammer things that no longer match the current version of Warhammer. But there's good stuff in there. There's lots of cool things we can mess around with. It almost meant that we didn't use Volgograd inside our version of Kislev and didn't include it because it was so vilified by certain quarters within the Games Workshop writing teams. So the reason that it wasn't brought in to 4th edition is because it has nothing to do with the campaign that we were building, the Enemy Within. It was never designed to be a component of the Enemy Within campaign, and the content that it included was so old that updating it would effectively have turned it into an entirely new adventure. So when we were building the new version of the Enemy Within with Graham Davis was like, no, I just want to rewrite it and make a new version entirely called the Horned Rat, because that was always supposed to be the next step of the Enemy Within campaign, and we never managed to see that one through. So I'd really like to do that. And I was like, this sounds perfect. Let's build that book instead. So we went with the Horned Rat.
There you go. Mr. Grumbler, Warhammer Quest, Cursed City, Prague. That's a mouthful. Sounds good. What's your favorite Cursed City from any setting or IRL? Well, I will say that I'm quite partial to Prague, but as an American, I also have, I don't know if you'd consider it cursed, but growing up, the disappearance of the settlement of Roanoke is always a pretty big one for a lot of Americans. The whole Croatoa thing, where a Virginia colony literally just vanished off the face of the earth, and like somebody showed up there and there was just weird words written on a tree, but the population was gone and the settlement was intact, but there was just no people. They just vanished off the face of the earth, and it was a really big mystery that was never solved, and makes for a cool story. That's spooky.
Okay, so my favorite overall fictional one is probably Nadsakor, the City of Beggars from the Elric books, because it was the first cursed city that I encountered in fiction that properly settled in my mind as an imaginative place. I got a real good feeling of what it looked like. So that's nothing to do with Warhammer. If it's on the Warhammer side, it's probably Musalon. And the reason that I like Musalon in particular is because it was the first city that I ever mapped officially for Games Workshop. And I had to do it with a mouse. So I wasn't using a drawing stick. I wasn't drawing it by hand. I literally created that map with a mouse. It's not a good map. It was a black and white map that was added to a book called Barony of the Damned for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. But it nevertheless holds a special place in my heart because of that.
Yeah, Moorcock mentioned Skull.
It's not the first Moorcock mention this time.
Inquisitor Thomas. So in a Tome game where you're a young Empire noblewoman who has to marry one of several Empire nobles, and secret spicy option where you go after Archaon instead, who you can totally fix. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that would be an accurate reflection. Although there would almost certainly be, if you want to be a proper accurate reflection of the customer base and how it often focuses in on these hyper masculine characters, you would also want to have one hyper feminine one there, which
that's why you do the Elector counts. That way you get Countess Emmanuel.
Exactly, Emmanuel, and your chaos option should definitely be in there as well, perhaps as some form of Slaneshi demon, because a lot of people on that particular game spectrum really enjoy Slanesh and that aspect of her.
That Sigvald just shows up randomly.
Yeah, you should make it Sigvald.
Thunder and Silence. Hey guys, watch a lot of your Lord discussions and love your stuff. Belated birthday, Sotek. Thank you very much. Quick aside question: how long is a day in the Warhammer world? Given its size, I assume it should be longer than 24 hours, should it not?
So I picked this up in one of my very, very, very first videos that I popped up online for LAWhammer. And I did a quick test stream. Was it a test stream? No, it was a test video where I was just checking the mics that we had, which weren't very good, but they did. So you'll find that I discussed this, and I think I call it the Warhammer dating, perhaps.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
And everyone thought that I was discussing how to date in the Empire. Dating in the Empire, that might have been it. And you're absolutely correct. The length of day in the Warhammer world is probably longer than the real world one. Most writers just don't worry about that because it's too much of a headache. It does mean, though, that if you look at the Warhammer year, the Warhammer day, the Warhammer weeks are also bigger at 8 days in a week rather than 7 days in a week. And you actually look at the proper time. If this is accurate, you would probably find someone who would say 16 in the Warhammer world is the equivalent of someone who's 20 in the real world, and possibly older. So the dooming that takes place when you're 10 in the Warhammer world and you become a full-blown adult might not sound as daft as it potentially could do for a full-blown adult at the age of 10. Having said that, though, not only is this ignored by most writers, it's very, very much massaged over and purposely forgotten because it makes things complicated, meaning that in the Warhammer world, we have a species of human that almost certainly lives significantly longer than real world humans. Whereas
something magic, something, yeah.
And they grow more slowly, they mature more slowly, they mature at effectively the same rate per year, in that by the time they're 12, they look like 12-year-olds in the real world. By the time they're 16, they look like 16-year-olds in the real world. But true, if we're doing it properly true, if a character, say, reach their 70s in the Warhammer world, they're probably equivalent to someone who's reached their 90s in the real world. And that is a really fascinating topic that no writer will ever pick up because it makes it difficult. I remember an interview with Kim Newman, who was one of the original Warhammer authors, saying, wait a minute, there's 400 days in a year? Doesn't that mean that everybody's older than they should be? Wait a minute, the planet's bigger, doesn't that mean? And he said, yeah, well, I'm going to ignore that. And that became the standard for all writers from that point onwards.
I feel like that's kind of one of those things where, like, if Warhammer was written by one person, there would be some very intricate details about all of this information. But because it's written by a ton of people, they're like, no, we're not. We're not dealing with this shit. Move on. Let's go. Keep it moving.
Yeah, so if you want to know my version is that they are indeed a species of humanity that ages more slowly. They are bigger, stronger, different to real world equivalents. And that is largely because of something magic, something. The fact that the winds of magic are tearing through this world changes everything, and humanity, which is particularly susceptible to the winds anyway, across the world are different to real world humans, and they age more slowly, they mature more slowly, they also mutate in a variety of horrible ways, which doesn't happen in the real world either. But loosely speaking, they are almost a different species to the humans that we have in the real world.
They're human adjacent.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why I think the 40k versus Warhammer thing would be much more interesting than most people realize, because it's pretty clear that the core basic human in Warhammer is probably basically bigger, better, stronger, more resilient than the equivalent in the 40k realm, because they're flooded with magic for their entire lives, and it changes them. And that's just 40k average human is an emaciated, broken bit of tech inside them to try to keep them going along mess. So yeah, it's fun.
Oh, one day we'll have to do a raid stream and it will be so fun. Ricky Chapman, still working on our homebrew Everchosen, Aurora the Witch Eater, Bane of Grand, Queen of Cannibals, and the Bond Breaker. Still writing the patch he took and decided they're going to avoid Prague altogether. A lot of Chaos Invasions did. Prague, as we'll kind of talk about when we get a little bit into the War with Azavar Cool, Prague was something that Chaos Champions, many of them would angle towards, because it was this great bastion that hadn't been conquered in a long time, and to be the one to do it would bring great glory in the eyes of the gods. But some of the more, we'll say, realistic ones would look at it and go, nope, not dealing with that shit, and would go around it for easier targets. A lot of the spring drivings would avoid the really gigantic cities and go after easier targets unless it was a particularly large chaos invasion, which most aren't. A lot of people think that chaos is like, it's horizon to horizon, but a lot of them are like war bands of like maybe like 100 guys. Now they're devastating, but this is why a lot of the Ungol stuff talks a lot about how the Ungol people often will pick up nomadic type lifestyles for when spring is coming and stay on the move, and are really big about your horse is your life, because not only is the environment dangerous, but it's literally the only way we can keep ahead of the chaos people, because they'll go after the small settlements rather than the big unbreakable city unless you've got the full weight of at least one of the gods behind you. And for most of Prague's history, almost all of Prague's history, one chaos god behind you was not enough. You need more, which says a lot.
Yeah, Prague stood for a very long time. It's only really been taken for certain twice, once by the Gospodars and once by Azavar Kul, which for a city in the location that it's in is extraordinary, truth be told.
Mm-hmm. Gaston. To be frank, I would enjoy a Lorebeards on courting in various cultures. Well, I mean, Valentine's Day is coming up, I suppose.
Certainly is.
I'll have to think about that.
That's this Friday, isn't it? That's this Friday.
Yeah, it is.
That means
for anyone out there that may be having a little, for anyone that may be having a little panic thing, Valentine's Day is this Friday. This is your warning for anyone that's forgotten. Let's see. Baron Von Bastard, unrelated question that I already asked Andy. Sotek, from a lore perspective only, what is your favorite Total War Warhammer campaign and the implications it has? Oh, in Total War, for me, it would actually be, I would probably say if you take them all at 100% face value, just looking at them, for me, probably Nakai showing up in Cathay to like attack a lot of the forces that are threatening Cathay around that region, and act almost as a bulwark against the Naga from the south, because that would imply that the Lizardmen, or at least some forces among the Lizardmen, actually favor Grand Cathay and are trying to help protect it from chaos sympathetic forces, which would be a pretty fascinating can of worms to crack open. Or because Nakai is there for some other reason. But Nakai especially I really like, because Nakai is driven by more of a sense of the old ones. Sort of, he almost sort of has like a pre-planned navigation set in his head that tells him where he needs to be at particular times. So for him to have like shown up in Southern Cathay in like 2512 or 2505 or whatever it is, would be a really fascinating development of why is he there and what's going on with that. So that would probably be one that I would really enjoy exploring.
For me, it was the Advisor himself, Total War 3.
The Advisor is great. I mean, I agree. I will say the Advisor is, granted, we've already done a whole fucking stream on him. The Advisor is by far the most interesting character in the entire Total War series, because he's unique. He's unique to Total War, and he has an actual story, which is great.
Yeah.
Sedgemeister, would sexual dimorphism between Warhammer human sexes be as pronounced as it is in our world, or is the gap between a standard male and female human smaller?
So in my world, and it has to be my world, because in the overall Games Workshop fiction, there is no answer to this, and it's never tackled directly. It is, however, indirectly tackled, and it's indirectly tackled in character generation by showing that all characters have the same base stats. And this was by choice. There was no, we will make, a slight difference for women having stats that are perhaps a little more this or a little less that, and men will have stats that are a little more this and a little less that, or we'll add some other bizarre choice that does something else on top of all of that. That was pushed aside. Instead, we just went with a blanket. It's the same for everybody. And I think that is absolutely potentially the case in the Warhammer world. And by that, I mean, because it is a world flooded full of magic, it's also a world where the gods are in place, that there are some women who are just as big, as strong, and as capable as as men. And they absolutely are much more common. But the core differences between the two sexes, I think, still stand, as in women are generally shorter and generally less strong because of that, with longer levers. Men are generally taller, and thus they dominate things like the military front line. But as has been noted in multiple places in Warhammer's background, there are many women in the military. There are many women who are as capable as the men in the military, just as strong, just as able to sit in the front line and hold off against the incoming orc threat or whatever else they may have. It's not the real world. And I think that your question is actually really, really good, because I think behind it all, we have a very clear story of why the Warhammer world is different. And that is, it's flooded full of magic, and gods bless some people for their own obscure, uncertain reasons. And some women are elevated, some men are elevated, and they are significantly more in terms of almost everything than many of their peers.
Yeah.
So yes.
I want to jump in here and say that I actually think Warhammer, without deliberately spelling it out, makes the answer to this very, very simple, which is that if you think about the greatest, most powerful champions of some of the most physically daunting factions, Kislev, the greatest physical warrior alive in Kislev right now is Naryeska Lesa. She's a woman and she's gigantic. She is literally the biggest, strongest fighter Kislev has, the current Golden Knight. Valkia is Khorne's favorite chosen, a woman, and she is like, Khorne didn't pick her because he wanted an actual wife. Khorne picked her because she embodied everything that he desires out of mortals and put into a single body. Yeah. And that's not even bringing up, like, you have your Rapunzel de Leoness, who was a mere peasant. She didn't even have like a good genetics or like a great upraising, and she gets so empowered she kills a Chaos Lord of Nurgle in single combat. Warhammer just plays different. It plays different.
So my summary on that one would be that the general sexual dimorphism that we know from the real world is reflected in Warhammer, but at the extremes, the differences between the sexes are negligible. And that's both on the smallest side and on the biggest side. And I think that makes Warhammer a much more interesting setting because of that. It's certainly one where sexism is not as hard-coded or as hard-baked into it, because we don't have the same physiologies just at a base level. And I think that's fun.
Yeah. So let's talk about Praag for a bit more. So Praag. So going back to Andy's intro, there's a lot of really, really fascinating things about Praag that is really core to understanding the city. I think understanding why it's a really fun, interesting place, which is, like Andy said, the fact that when a lot of people look at Praag, they just see, oh, it's like the northern fortress, when that's not actually what it really was. It was a fortress. It did have like double layered walls that were incredibly powerful, enchanted with dwarven runes carved into them, and all of these layered defenses, because thankfully when they did the of course Andy talked about it with Steve Dean himself, when they did the Realms of the Ice Queen, there was some thought put into how the hell have these guys been holding off against chaos invasions for 1,000 years. And the answer is that they had incredible defenses, but it's also this bastion of civilization with people from all over the world. Where you have these, like Andy said, you have a Cathayan district, which is really cool considering how ahead of its time that was, considering that is definitely going to be a major story beat for the old world, with Cathay being a full-on playable faction now. Mm-hmm. But you have like the whole bunch of Cathayan traders. You have all these various forces that are sympathetic to the civilization, we'll put it that way, hanging out in this city. And one of the things that I'm so excited with the old world is that a lot of the views that we get of Praag, of this cursed city, are that it's not in its golden era, right? It's in a post-apocalyptic recovery stage by the time we catch up with it in pretty much every setting. But with the old world, we actually are going to be able to see Praag at its absolute prime, where it is quite literally the shining city on the hill. A city that was so wealthy that they literally used silver in their architecture because they had so much of it. So the city literally gleamed in the sunlight, in the snow. And it was a beautiful place of the arts, with a full an orchestra hall, an opera house, a music academy, which actually gets reinforced and referenced in Total War, of that it's this beautiful, wonderful place of culture and art and life and all this diversity before chaos shows up.
And rebellion.
Yeah, and rebellion. Yeah, which any good, heavily populated Warhammer city should have in abundance.
Yeah. It's a lovely example of a city that, come the old world, I think could almost stand as a perfect place where we can go, you want to fight Kislev versus Kislev? This is why you can.
Yeah, but it's built so well. If it has this horrifying, imposing, almost kind of ugly in a sense because of how many cannons and stuff are coming off of it. Citadel of Prague up on this big old hill, and the city just slowly stretches out beneath it. So it's got this really easy to defend set of structures that made it where when chaos approaches, they're just getting bombarded the whole time as they approach. You get to the first wall, and it's this noted as being this horrible wall that's not only deeply enchanted, but covered in spikes at all sorts of points. So if you try and climb it, your hands get shredded and you get punctured on the wall. And then you get over that wall and realize there's a second wall less than a yard behind it that's full of murder holes. So as soon as you come over the first wall, they shoot you, so you fall back off the wall. So to get into Prague requires overwhelming so many defenses, which does such a good job of showing why it was so strong for so long. I even love that there's in the Rome of the Ice Queen, there's this mention about how the city has all this internal strife issues until chaos spring driving comes. And then everyone's mindset changes to, oh, we're not all these separate groups. We're Praguers. We are the people of Prague. Regardless of where you come from, who you are now a Praguer. Pick up your gun, get ready to fight. Because Prague gets surrounded. It is not a place with the best agriculture. The soil in that part of the world has never been particularly great, and they rely on a lot of imports. So they do very well for it because, once again, a very wealthy city. But that means they know they're going to get surrounded. They don't have like lots of easy settlements or little fortresses nearby. When an enemy comes, everyone's go-to strategy is going to be to surround the city. But Prague's ready for that. It's a hardy place. Which one of the big tragedies that also makes it so fun to read about is, of course, then Azavar Kul shows up. And we've talked a lot about the Siege of Prague, so I'm not going to wax too big on it. We talked a lot about it back in the Arbal stream, where we know that Arbal, the Undefeated, and of course, Kolek Suneater also played incredibly massive roles in the fight, where Arbal, the only way he could even get through the gate, despite being fucking Arbal, is that he had to order all of the troops around him just keep charging until there were so many dead that the Chaos Warriors were able to climb up the bodies over the walls, which is horrifying. And then Kolek Suneater shows up, and it's basically Attack on Titan, where he smashes the walls down because Kolek's so fucking big, he can see over them. And he smashes through them and goes on to rampage in the Temple District, and the city is horribly, horribly sacked. But this is where we get to the important part of the story, which is what Azavar Kul actually does, which is after Prague falls and Chaos is having all their fun and all that stuff, Azavar Kul eventually rallies his horde back together to get them back on the march, because they take a couple days to sort of enjoy the destruction of the city. And when Azavar Kul is leaving, he doesn't just leave it as I raised the city. No, he wants to make a fucking statement that Prague is his. It belongs to Chaos. And he gets all of his sorcerers together, this big old coven, and he has them unleash this horrible, horrible fucking curse on Prague. And it's a spell that's said to be so awful that it causes a lot of the survivors, because there were a lot of people who managed to hide or were kept alive on purpose as captives within the city and left there. When this spell comes down and hits the city, the people melt into the stone itself. Like, everything becomes so meldable that the dead, the living, people whose spirits are still kind of hanging around because the agony in which they died, all of these awful, horrible things that happen, and a lot of Azavar Kul's own troops who didn't listen to him and were still pillaging around the city because they're being idiots, but Azavar Kul doesn't give a fuck because he's got more. They all literally, like, imagine the stone around you basically turning into liquid, and it's reaching up and grabbing you and sucking you down. And there's no escape. And the worst part is, it's not going to kill you. You don't die. This is literally an eternal hell. One of the things we get a mention of that I hope never gets too detailed, because I think it's better kept as vague as possible to let the imagination run wild, is what the cavalry of Magnus the Pious's army finds when they get to Prague. Because Magnus's army actually splits when it's heading towards Kislev city, where the cavalry go to Prague because they think it's still under siege. So they ride to Prague with all haste, hoping to break the siege and save the city. And they arrive and find the most awful, just unspeakably horrible thing. It said that they were so traumatized and full of agony that they were all just weeping. That's all they could do, was just weep at what had been done to Prague. And they turn around and chase Asvarkul's army. And such was their rage when they fall upon his rear guard that it's a massacre. Because they had a lot of Kislevites with them, the winged lancers and a bunch of other guys. And they obliterate Asvarkul's rear guard, which of course he doesn't notice because his army is so massive, and end up showing up at the most opportune time to help break the siege of Kislev. But the aftermath of that city would have been indescribable, and I hope it is never described. Because it should
in several places. Sadly, they talk about I mean, even in Realms of the Ice Queen, there's a little pitch by Steve where he talks about the walls having eyes blistering out across them, and
it's not too specific.
A perpetual rain of severed fingers landing behind.
The rain of severed fingers.
Behind one of the spires, black blood literally running down from the now ravaged walls, which are now covered with profane, unholy symbols. It's proper broken. And when Asvarkul passes on, he leaves behind a shattered, tainted mess. And when the survivors of this particular battle, after the Great War Against Chaos comes to an end, return to the city, with the help of Magnus the Pious, they both cleanse and burn the place to the ground in an attempt to try and get rid of all the taint. It's also worth noting that the city has a significant undercity, which is all the tunnels and the caverns and all the rest that lies underneath. And they somehow managed to get away relatively clean, meaning that there is a bunch of survivors that moved down and then came up to this mutated horror. Many of which almost certainly mutated themselves upon arriving at it. And given what we know of the place, it's obvious why underneath the cities managed to maintain its lack of taint. And that's because there's a goddess down there who literally emanates an aura of purity that ensures that the area never truly properly corrupts entirely. Because given what it was done to it, this place should never have been in any way reclaimable. But the Ungauls being the Ungauls, there was no chance they weren't going to try and attempt to reclaim it, and they do.
Yeah, one of the things that I will say is Prague to me is such a incredibly badass show of the Ungauls and Kislevites' level of resilience. That they come back to basically a hellhole that any reasonable, perfectly normal people would have looked at and said, nope, fuck this, let's burn it to the ground and go build somewhere else. And Kislev comes to the city and says, no, fuck chaos, we're taking this back and we're gonna heal everything we can, we'll tear down the rest, and we will rebuild it brick by fucking brick. And they do.
And they absolutely do. And it also speaks to the character of the city post the Great War Against Chaos. It takes a long time, obviously, decades. But the city that we get afterwards is haphazard in planning, in style. It's broken. Many of the old walls still hold the sockets where eyes used to be, or screaming faces. Some of them huge in either the walls or the great cliff sides or any equivalent. But they are a living, and not so much living, but at least almost a sculpted reminder of what happened to what was the Jewel of the North, one of the most beautiful cities and rich cities that not only Kislev had, but the old world itself had. This enormous, perfect bastion that had been entirely obliterated. And whereas somewhere like that in the Empire, they would have done everything about basically chopping it up, making it all hidden, hiding this taint from the past, because that's how the Empire works. The corruption lies within. The Kislevites have got a very different culture. To them, it was almost a point of pride that they have not been defeated by this. And much of the city still has significant remnants of the horrendous past of change that was wrought upon the city, which makes it pretty horrific to wander through, because there is just it's not a living reminder. I keep on wanting to say that. There is just reminders of what the city has been through around every single corner. Many of those corners themselves will be broken and shattered and etched with the change that has been running through it. Stone that looks like it's just melted and spilled across a road, or alternatively, as we say, many bits that look like bone coming out of the rock, but it's made of stone instead. The taint and its effect is in every part of the city, and some parts, particularly over up in the up over in the northwest, are still unreclaimed. They can't do anything. A heavy green miasma hangs over the entirety of the area in a place called the Bleakness, where literally every night the undead stir, spirits scream, things that should never move, and the entire place has to be effectively defended. They have an enormous furnace there where they just burn the bodies that have come back up, or burn the things that have somehow come around again. And yeah, it's a pretty grim place, but nope, Ungolls aren't leaving it.
Yeah, fun fact, don't commit crimes in Prague, because the Bleakness can and will be used against convicts. Either you will be put on the detail service to like protect the edge around it, or you'll be put on the day service of going and collecting all the zombies and the horrible gribblies that came up and chucking them in the furnace. It sucks. Don't go there. It is a terrible place. The Bleakness is awful. The dead do not rest easy in Prague.
That's one of the reasons why it's such a fun place. We have a broken, shattered city that very much speaks to the Ungol character of is no matter. And they just keep going. They will not be defeated. Give them another 100 years, and this city would probably be entirely reclaimed. Give it another 100, and it's completely clean. But that will never happen, because as we know, the end times comes.
Sadly, they ran out of time. But so when it comes to the cleansing of the city, as you might guess from the fact that it's known very well as the Cursed City, it's not 100% done. There are still some dangerous parts, and Prague is very much a city. One of my favorite descriptions of it from the Gotrek and Felix novels is how Prague is spoken of as a city that, especially if you're in the old parts of the city or the poorer parts of the city, so not as close to the Citadel or the Temple District, you do not wander the city alone. And you should not go out at night because it's dangerous. One of the things they talk about that is horrifying, but I love, is that if you're walking around, sometimes you'll hear just a scream and you'll turn around and there's nobody there. Or you might be walking down an alley and you'll hear whispers and you look to your right and you'll see like people pressing from the other side of the stone, reaching out to you, begging you to help them or calling you closer. And now, most people will see that and go, holy shit, run away, I need therapy. But there are tales within Prague about people who follow these voices and they vanish. Yeah. They walk into an alley that's a dead end because they heard someone calling to them and they're never seen again.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to imagine this location, basically take any part of the city, even the places that look fine, and always add something wrong. So, for example, some walls bleed every night. Some stone, perfectly looking fine roads at nighttime bubble up with ichor from the demons that were once living here for a long time before they were cleansed. You go to any building, it will have some form of ghost. It will have some form of spirit associated with it. The city itself is anathema to wizards. Wherever they go and attempt to cast their spells, they often go wrong, very wrong, and might summon something else, demons even, that come in from the aether in response to the tears that have clearly happened in reality here back at 200 years earlier, leaving this place just sensitive to all the worst that the Warhammer world has to offer. But nevertheless, it is a huge, thriving city that absolutely refuses to back down. But mutation is common, altogether too common. And we also have people who are, all of the people are kind of sickly and odd and ill-favored. Whether it's they look wan and drawn, they're more prone to disease or some other issue. Indeed, this was such a core component of the city that rules were added to the game for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay when we're doing the book to say, yeah, if you're born here, you're probably a bit fucked. A whole bunch of, extra afflictions were added. But if you did that, you also gained an extra fate point. To show that you were magically touched in some ways by something, because Prague and Praggers are different to people who may have been raised in any other place inside Kislev or indeed the old world. It's not just all bad. You get an extra fate point, but they tend to be emaciated or broken or just prone to being a bit weird.
Yeah, but it's such a kind of like we mentioned earlier, it makes for such a perfect place for, like, you could run an entire multi-year campaign just in the city of Prague and never leave and have a great time. The amount of weird, sinister things going on, where if you really like the concept of like having almost fey rules, but in a civilized urban environment, Prague is where you go. Of a place where you go to a particular square, there's a statue there, and people say, don't go there between this hour and this hour because the statue moves and it watches you and it tries to move towards you. And if you're touched, you're gone, or it'll snap your neck or whatever you want to do. And it's a place where that can happen. And then in day, it appears perfectly normal.
Yeah. There definitely appears to be a strong day-night difference. And in Warhammer lore, that's often because the winds at night, the winds of magic, shift where they move to. Actually, for example, that burning bright wind rises up towards the sun during the day and then falls down towards the earth and all the living creatures and the heat and the arguments or the issues that they might have, meaning that a different spread of magic is inside the city during the night. And in a place that's magically sensitive, it causes things to go weird. And that's the case for all the winds. The winds of magic here are disturbed, and there's a bit more of them. We're already relatively far north already, which means we have far more of the winds of magic here, for example, than we would in most parts of the Empire. Although it is worth noting that Altdorf almost certainly has more. Colleges of magic are built on a great nexus of magic points. But in Kislev, this is the biggest city in the north, so thus the city with the most magic that has run through it from the Chaos Gate to the north. And because it's so broken from what happened to it 2 centuries before, things happen every single night. And that's why people go indoors. That's why people retreat to their temples. And there's a host of fun temples throughout the city, including a couple of Kislevite gods that very, very rarely ever get mentioned anywhere else. I'm pretty sure this is where we drop the god of traders, the silver-handed god of traders of Kislev, whose name escapes me off the top of my head. But he's got his primary temple up here because he was one of the old Ungol gods. It will come back to me. No, well, it doesn't matter. It'll come back to me in time. But yeah, he's definitely there as well.
Kalita.
Thank you, Kalita. Thanks. I'm glad somebody picked it up. So yeah, Kalita, the silver-handed god of traders. And that's again to show that the Ungols had their own deep spiritual wealth that spoke to the society that they had before the arrival of the Gospodars. The Gospodars are often seen as the civilizers of the 2 primary peoples of Kislev, and the Ungols are often seen as the horse lords who wander around between the places. But it's simply not the case. The Ungols had their own great history, their own cities before the arrival of the Gospodars. But with the arrival of the Gospodars, they were generally pushed out of their cities. Both Erengrad that's over on the coast, and Prague were both big cities for the Ungols long before the Gospodars arrived and invaded and hacked everyone to pieces.
Yeah, as they like to do. All right, we're going to take a quick super chat break, and then we will get back into some other interesting aspects of it, talking about a couple of things that were like added to the city after the war, like the Magnus Gardens and a few other things. So first up, we've got nope, there it is. Baron von Bastard, another unrelated question. What for you is the ugliest model Games Workshop ever released?
They released a lot of very ugly models, particularly back in the metal days. They also released some gorgeous models from back then too. But I famously always pull on the first version of Nagash. You can't not. It was such a beautiful idea. The artwork that we got for Nagash was super cool from Mark Gibbons. Then they did the model, which, as far as I'm aware, was being made at the same time as the artwork, meaning that two people were working on the same project at the same time. And the Nagash model we got was not good. And
I'll be honest.
I've tried to make it look good. I've painted that one several times. It's hard.
I think for me, the model that when I see it invokes a personal sense of ugh. For me would have to be the original, or not the original, but the first Lizardman Slon. The big cartoonishly mouth-sized toad.
Very 5th edition.
Who's got a big belly with weird warts and scribbly shit all over him, and he's just lounging as 4 temple guard carry him on pieces of sticks. I hated that model so much.
I painted that one a couple of times as well. 5th edition in general, for 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, had a very cartoony tone. Ranging from, and you could really see that with the releases that came out, the first new upgraded Bretonnians, with their cartoon fairy tale castles, and dragons swooping down, very cartoony, and knights lancing towards them like heroes of old, or the Slan as they were first pitched with ridiculous names, every single last one of them being a pun, and very cartoony models often being built to, that Slan is not great.
So you can imagine my joy as a child that started at the very end of 5th edition when the 6th edition Lizardman hit, and it was like, oh, these look fantastic in comparison. These look so much better. But yeah. Jordan, what is a progger's favorite genre of music? Prague rock.
Do you like myself a bit of Prague rock?
Charles DK, given how narratively beefed up all his underlings are, would it be interesting to sidestep needing Asvar Kul to be an impossible warrior by having him be a master chaos diplomat and tactician? No, because to be ever chosen requires certain things.
Yeah, this isn't like, for example, when we were building the different children of, well, not the children, the
siblings of Tamarkan.
Siblings of Tamarkan, that'd be better. Where we could build very different characters who had each arrived at their dominance through different routes. This is an Everchosen, and the Everchosen has certain tasks that have to be completed to draw the attention of all 4 of the great chaos powers, and potentially other minor powers as well. That in no way would allow them to be relatively weak in combat, ever. They would definitely need to be an absolute monster. And they would become, if anything, even more so once they have been empowered by all 4 chaos powers to be the personal representative of them in the material plane. It's going to be a monster. No other way of putting it. Not someone who's easy. Archeon is not a unique individual. Archeon is just the 13th version of what an Everchosen could be. And Archeon's proper daft in terms of his stats. The same will be the case for Asvar Kul.
Yeah, you have to remember that these guys have to be able to beat the living shit out of any greater demon or demon prince or chaos lord or chaos sorcerer lord that's going to try and cause problems for them. So they literally have to be the creme de la creme of everything chaos has to offer.
So whilst that would be a fun idea, and I'm sure you could probably build one Everchosen who had a different route to power, who did things slightly differently, regardless of how they got there, they are going to end up a monster.
Yeah. Mobarak A. Lorebeards has made me a lore snob. If I see another stream and they don't get into nitty-gritty parts of the lore, I just can't enjoy it. Oh, I'm sorry. We ruined your podcast experience.
That, those streams where people just read parts of the wiki no longer do it for you.
Oh, man. Yeah, it's always I'm gonna stop myself where I say something incriminating. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Some people just have different standards, which is fine. Baron von Bastard, Asvar Kul remodeling service, so grand it's guaranteed to bring you to tears. Ah, yes, the good old melt your house like wax method.
Yeah, totally. Yes, is the answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to Prague for a little bit. So there are not all of Prague is a complete hellhole. Like we kind of talked about, there's a lot of parts that are genuinely beautiful. That over the last 200 years, the people of Prague have done an immaculate job rebuilding. Yeah. The Magnus Gardens are a really particularly good example of this, where obviously Magnus the Pious, the Kislevites were very gracious towards him saving Kislev, and he also, one of the things that's really interesting about Magnus, and one of the reasons that I love him so much as a character, is that a lot of stories when the Great War would have ended, you would expect kind of the heroic savior character to just turn around and go home because he's in somebody else's nation. Magnus didn't. Magnus went to Kislev, and one of the things that's mentioned is Magnus wanted to specifically see for himself with his own eyes what chaos had done to the city, and it put him through a lot.
Shook,
like, because the great hero Magnus that left to go save Kislev versus Emperor Magnus, who came back after witnessing what had happened at Prague, were two very different men.
Yeah. Gazing upon the horror of Prague, and also the weeping, the wailing, the horror of the survivors, many of which will have been cut down and burned because they have become mutated, pathetic creatures. The walls themselves screaming because people had fused with them. These are not tainted demons reaching out to try and kill you. These are lost human souls, defenders who had been previously hoping that Magnus would arrive in time, because it's stated in more than one place that Magnus the Pious's great build-up across the empires, he bound the various lords of the empire together, spread his way through the grand provinces as they were back then, and eventually hiked his way over to Kislev. This story is known. It's not like Kislev thought they were, Prague thought there was no hope. Quite the opposite was the case. They knew Magnus the Pious was coming. They were on the walls defending in the hope that Magnus the Pious's forces would relieve them before the end. And he didn't get there in time. In many respects, it's an exceedingly sad story, because the defenders were all there, hope in their hearts, facing off against the worst that chaos can throw against them. And it's truly awful. And then, once they're defeated, they are not simply killed. They are often made a part of the city itself, left to scream and moan the failures of Magnus and what he could not do in time. And when Magnus the Pious arrives there, it's almost certain he heard them.
Yeah, a part of me a part of me is like, hearing people literally screaming out your name as they're horribly whatever the fuck this is, and having to order your own troops, and probably in his own hands having to go and start hacking apart these walls, putting these people down to put them out of their misery if you can.
If you can, yeah, quite. Or just burning it. And sometimes burning it with magic, sometimes blessing it with the different gods that you might have with you, whether it's Shalia, Sigmar, or anything else. An attempt to try and reclaim what has happened, or at least hold it in place. It's turned into a giant mutant city. And it's a mutant city that is filled with hatred of Magnus and his failure. And that, to a degree, will last in the city right up to its modern day, where Magnus is both the great savior of the city, but the ghosts that lie behind the scenes were betrayed by the promise that he offered. And the promise that he offered was, I will save you, I will come. And he never managed to get there in time. An entire cavalry force was sent north to try and relieve the city, but it got there far too late. And what it saw so horrified them that it turned round and slammed into the northern contingent of Asvar Kul at the gates of Kislev.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, imagine if the Rohirrim had arrived to Minas Tirith a week after the city had been razed to the ground.
Yeah,
but worse, because they didn't just burn it, just worse. And if anything, I think that does a good job of showing how important Prague is in the setting, because of how much it influences Magnus's policies when he goes back to the Empire, of going, we need the colleges of magic, of him, of after how many hundreds of years that somebody could have done it, him being like, no, we need to go to Mordheim and we need to burn this shit to the ground.
Yeah, I think that is a key component of the thought process of Magnus the Pious, because when he returns to the Empire, sets himself up in Nuln as the Emperor, the people of the Empire demand that he is made Emperor, much to the chagrin and annoyance of the various nobles who do not want him, because they have been ruling themselves for a very, very, very long time. But he reforges the Empire as a whole and goes to the greatest, most cursed city in the Empire and completely flattens it. And you can see the reasoning behind that. He has seen what happened to Nuln. He knows that Mordheim exists within the borders of the Empire, but that's very different to actually visiting it and seeing the horror that it is. But he has now seen the horror of Prague and what Mordheim almost certainly has become over time as it's fallen. And he's like, no, never, ever again. And I think one other last point on this one that is worth noting, Prague is a city that is known across the old world. It is the gateway to the east in the north. It is a city that is on the lips of anyone who is important in the entirety of the old world, not just the Empire, not just Tilia or Kislev or Estalia or Bretonia. It is a shining example of the pinnacle that humanity can reach, a center of culture. It creates the finest pieces of art, whether that is poetry, opera, whether that is pieces of silverwork or beautiful works of gold. It is an exemplar in many respects of what humanity can do, and it has been crushed. And its loss is felt not just in Kislev, but across the old world, because the great gate to the north has been closed. And I think that also speaks to one of the reasons why Kislev had to rebuild Prague. They had almost no choice, even if they built it 5 miles down the river and decided to build it there instead. But they
Prague,
didn't.
yeah.
They reclaimed the entirety of the city, no matter how bad it was. It wasn't just, it had to be redone for a national perspective with the young Gauls, or tribal perspective perhaps, or a national one for the Kislevites. It was almost humanity's pride had been pricked, and they had to do something to say that no, we stood, and we stood. It's a living example that chaos will not win. But as we know, the Prague never really recovers, and chaos eventually do win.
Yeah, though there is something I think meaningful in showcasing that if they could have had enough time, it kind of shows that it can be done, though. Like, chaos can be pushed back even when they do the absolute worst that they can throw at the world. There are people that can genuinely put it back together again, which I find deeply moving, generally.
Yeah, and I think it's a very hopeful message, potentially, that chaos can be overcome. And that's one of the reasons it had to be reclaimed. It's not just about the victory that Magnus had. It's also about claiming that that victory means something. Everything that was lost can be rebuilt. And I think Prague is a standing example of that. You can see why rebuilding it was so core and important. Pardon me.
Yeah. That being said, chaos is not the only force that is in Prague besides humanity. There is another force that's actually very well worth diving into, which is that there is a big population of good old vampires within Prague. Big enough that it's not just one bloodline. There's actually 3 that are heavily present in the city. Of what we would technically consider a von Karstein lineage, though they would not consider themselves von Karsteins, because they draw their lineage back to Vashanesh when he was masquerading as a Kislevite, which we know that he did for a good while. So they're technically von Karstein, but not actual von Karstein.
I think it's worth giving a little bit of extra context here.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Kislev is a realm that has long history with the undead, and in particular vampires. They were ruled by a vampire, Bloody Catherine, for a very long time. And this is something that's often forgotten in their history for, I think, very obvious reasons from the perspective of Kislevites, who would want to remember that. Yeah, quite. But
they're like, nope, not thinking about that. Nope.
Yeah, let's not think about that. Bloody Katerin, a vampire, ruled Kislev, but from Kislev City, and that changed the tenor of all of Kislev forever. Where it was a nation that no longer, like the Empire, for example, had them hidden. Vampires are a core component of Kislev's history. It's well known by scholars. It's well known by anyone who knows anything about the long-term history of Kislev. And vampires, because they came to rule it pretty much openly, and this is something that, again, is often forgotten, openly, that left vampires gathering in that area, either to fight against this open vampire bloodline, a Lamian bloodline in this particular case, that was supposedly working in rebellion to the core bloodline.
Neferata was so pissed at
or
Bloody
was
Katerin.
she?
Well, we'll talk about her in just a second. I'm gonna let Andy.
Yeah, totally.
Or was she?
Yeah, totally. Because she's the ultimate manipulator. So you never can be certain exactly what the story behind the scenes were. But vampires are now ruling openly, and vampires from across the old world flooded to this place to either stop and stymie this bloodline that endangered them, or was potentially empowering the Lamians in a way that they didn't want, or alternatively to support or just live there now that they could do so in a fashion that potentially meant that they didn't need to hide. One of the things I always wish had been added to this was a stronger Strigoi element, because there's going to be some old ghoul kings.
Yeah, they would have been like, oh, it's the return of Strigos, let's go.
Exactly. And in my head, kind of my own version of what I would have built if I was writing the city parts, there almost certainly would have been some of that hinted at rather than necessarily detailed. So at least you can understand the mindset of the vampires that have set up shop. And we have 3 complete bloodlines in Prague alone. And I think that that's super, super fun. And it's not a great surprise, because Steve D, who was writing this part, also wrote the Night's Dark Masters book along with Jodie McGregor. So he had all of that vampire lore just sitting in his head going, well, obviously all this shit happened. I must make sure that I reflect that. And it isn't reflected over in the city of the Kislev city information inside probably not Night's Dark Masters, the Realm of the Ice Queen.
Yeah.
Because Graham McNeil wrote the Kislev City section, and he was not thinking about vampire bloodlines at all. But if anything, Kislev City is the one that should have it both most and also most hidden, because the Tsarevich Pavel Society, the great vampire hunters that came afterwards, have been cutting them down pretty much since Bloody Katerin was removed from power. And they are very much a strong society down there. But up in Prague, distant from Kislev City, we have a surprising number of vampires.
Yeah, which, fun fact, you can go visit Bloody Katerin to this day, because she got turned into a popsicle. And she is, I think she's sitting in the palace, if memory serves, because she got stabbed with a good piece of true ice and has been stuck there ever since.
In my end times, Bloody Katerin would have returned.
Yeah, which I will say is a fun thing that does lean towards Neferata maybe punishing her a good bit, because she could be removed from that ice, but she hasn't been for a very long time.
Yeah. I definitely think I would have had her come back. It would have been
she would have been a fun return character. So like Andy was saying, that it's very interesting, because in a lot of Kislev, vampires are not it's not like, oh, they're this forgotten, vague threat of a prior age. It's something that you can go see a vampire that has been essentially eternally imprisoned, practically on display as a Kislev being like, fuck vampires. And Kislev has a very strong anti-vampire sentiment that is very fresh for them. But in spite of that, you could almost say that it is one of several curses that has been laid upon Prague, of that it has a very, very strong vampiric background. So the once again, they're not technically von Karsteids, but you have the Vasilikovs, the Vasilikov bloodline, who are descended from who we understand as Vlad von Karstein, so you have them present. They've been there a long time. They've been there a crazy long time. They were like there before the Gospodar thing happened. They've been there for fucking ever.
And just so you get an idea, the Gospodar thing happens almost exactly 1,000 years ago, in that they sweep down the World's Edge Mountains into the area that is modern-day Kislev, much of which all the northern part is ruled by the Ungals. The mid part, a part of the mid part is ruled by the Ostlanders, and the Ostermarkers rule most of the south of modern Kislev 1,000 years ago. They get swept, the Gospodar sweep in, and over the course of a campaign that takes a few years, they wipe out the entire area and claim it as their own, apparently coming because of Mother Kislev herself.
Yeah, so you have this von Karstein line, who have been there with the Ungals pretty much as long as the Ungals have been there.
And I think it's worth noting that what Sotek said, so we don't get a slight, hey, this isn't a von Karstein line. It just isn't.
Yeah, I'll call them. I'll call them.
It's from the line of Vashinish. Yeah, so if you go to our Vlad von Karstein stream, we pretty much say it's Vashinish. Without what we do, but the books have got enough leeway that it might not be. It might not be. So that
it might not be, but it is. But it
totally
might not.
It 100% is, but it might not be. And if it isn't, that means these are expressly not von Karstein vampires. These are a unique line of Kislev vampires from the line of Vashinish. Now, the truth of it is, as I'm sure that we are going to stick with forever, Vashinish for a long time posed as someone called Vlad from Kislev, and this is where the bloodline almost certainly came from. And then eventually he moves south into Drak in Sylvania, as he passes through Ostland down into Sylvania, settles there, and we end up with vampire wars not long afterwards. But if you're being entirely pedantic, you could claim these are nothing to do with the von Karsteins at all, and you wouldn't necessarily be contradicting any lore.
Yep. Then we do have the Kalishniviks, I think I said that right, Kalishniviks, which are a Lamian line. And they are actually directly descended from Bloody Katerin.
So the Kalishniviks.
Kalishniviks. Thank you. That is a way better way to say that. Man, I was struggling with that. Kalishniviks. Thank you.
I was like that. That's not how I remember it. I'm going to go check me notes.
That sounds so much better and easier to pronounce. Thank you. So they are direct descendants of Bloody Katerin. So they're a Lamian line, but they tie back to a particular originator, and they have that source of pride there. They identify more with Bloody Katerin than they do with the Broad Lamians, which once again makes them a very unique take on a bloodline. So we have a von Karstein line that's not really von Karstein, and we have a Lamian line that's not really a Lamian line.
And what's super fun about this one is, if you were looking at it, it would not surprise me if this line is a line in exile, because the Tsarevich Pavel Society down in Kislev has pretty much kicked out all the vampires. And they're hiding amongst their own. And their own is probably Gospodars, and probably many of them might have been Ice Witches. These are powerful people who have become powerful vampires and are on the back foot, having been pursued by humans now across Kislev. So a fascinating bloodline. And again, regardless of the what might be, as in Neferatu may not have problems with them. I think it's clear that she did not like Bloody Katerin doing what Bloody Katerin was doing. We have ourselves effectively a unique bloodline of, again, Kislevite vampires. And this is beautiful.
Yep. And then, most fascinatingly, we have the Upernods, who are not aligned. It is not revealed who their bloodline founder is, because they don't seem to care, or it's someone that we don't know about. They are left very on purposely vague of they're either hiding who their founder is, or their founder might be the one of the unknown vampires, or it might be one of it could be Matt Mises, or I forget the one that went south, Harakte. But it could also be the mythical seventh bloodline. So there's a good mystery there of this third faction. The thing that's great is that Prague literally has vampire gang wars, which is so cool. They hate each other.
The Upernods are particularly interesting as well, because they're the bloodline that's attempting to maintain the peace too, because they don't want the vampires to be outed.
Yeah, they don't want a
because
Kislev repeat.
that will bring the Tsarevich Pavel Society in their way. So they have maneuvered themselves into the positions that often other Lamians would move into. Lamians, not other Lamians, that the Lamians would move into by attempting to control the boyars and the nobles and the most important merchants. Instead, it's the Upranovs that are doing this here. The Lamians don't. The Lamian line, so to speak, is almost certainly the Ice Witch. They just believe they should be ruling. They don't go and try and influence others, and they're often in hiding. So the Upranovs are this surprisingly powerful bloodline in the area who are constantly putting down the other vampires, lest they give away just how influenced Prague has been by the undead.
Yeah, so you have this kind of fascinating three-way kind of war in the shadows, because one of the things that the Vasilikovs and the say it one more time.
The Kalashinoviks.
Kalashinoviks. Those two are like on the cusp of all like outright war with one another at any given moment. And the Upranovs are the only thing holding a very tenuous piece together by the skin of their chinny chin chin. And it makes for this fascinating thing. Once again, what makes this such a fucking cool roleplay place is you have very extreme vampire politics going on in a chaos cursed city, which you could almost, if you want, you could even play around with the idea that it's kind of because of what Prague is that's almost driving these vampires to an even more extreme than they normally would be at.
And also gives them an opportunity to both gather and feed in a fashion that no other city does, because in Prague, you stay at home at night. Now, obviously, they've got big pubs and taverns and places you can go, but you try to avoid the streets because they are potentially dangerous or haunted or just corrupted in some way you don't want to get tangled up with. You might get jumped by a desperate mutant down a side street or some equivalent. So this is a city that is in the grip of a loose sense of terror anyway, and those who are lords of the night, the vampires, have more freedom to move. There are more opportunities to go from place to place. And if you're out there and you are a player of Vampire the Masquerade game, which is a very different game, and you're thinking, oh, could I use any of that game and port it over? Broadly speaking, yes. And what we have here is a line of Ventru, who are the ones who are ruling. We've got our line of Toreador, who believe they should be ruling. And we've got a line of Gangrel, who hate the Toreador here. The Toreador and the Gangrel are trying to kill each other, while the Ventru are attempting to hold some sort of peace above them. And I think that's really interesting in terms of these stereotypes, if you know your Vampire the Masquerade lore, because it's a perfect city for porting over details from that game if you wish to do so. So for you vampire fans out there, there's a little extra detail for you.
Yep. All right, I'm gonna get caught up on a little like super chat stuff. Orange and Crescent. It sounds like a city a dwarf could work in all their life to rebuild their ancestors' work. It's actually interesting you say that, because that is something that would be a core component of that. We know there were dwarf-built things within Prague. The walls were reinforced by dwarf runes. The moment that word would have got out that the city was being rebuilt, dwarfs would have come. The dwarfs' clans, their lines who helped build the city in the first place would say, all right, I'm going to go restore my ancestors' work. Time to get to it.
Yeah, I strongly agree with this, and it's something that I think that the current write-up, which is super old now because it's from the old Kislev book, the current write-up could definitely do with having as an addition, and that's the fact that there are going to be multiple clans with representatives inside the city who are both trying to reclaim the old work, rebuild and refashion what was broken, and also break down the taint that has been inflicted upon their ancestors' work. It's a point of personal pride for many of these craft guilds that have been properly almost attacked by chaos because it's the work of their ancestors. So yeah, old family lines, whether they are ones who are from fallen holds or whether they're from some of the relatively nearby holds in the World's Edge Mountains, there will be a significant dwarf population inside the city. As to where that is, most likely over in the west side somewhere for those who are.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to think that in a lot of ways, Prague would have probably deeply strengthened dwarf Kislevite relations, because the idea of reclaiming their city like that, I think dwarves would have been so deeply sympathetic to as a concept. It's like the human equivalent of reclaiming a lost hold. But requires, if anything, even more work, just due to the sheer amount of taint. But the humans actually buckled down on it. Which once again is one of those scenarios that I think could provide for really interesting role playing. If you're playing a dwarf character within the city of Prague, it can allow you to have a very unique relationship with human characters than you would in other places of the world. Biofoot, what would happen if Morgur came to Prague post mutation? I assume it wouldn't be a dance party. It'd probably be pretty awful. Granted, I will say that actually would tie well in kind of what we discussed in the Morgur stream, where depending on how you decide to play Morgur, Morgur most likely would never have any interest in coming to Prague. He's got priorities elsewhere. But if you wanted to make Morgur more of a more generalist god eater instead of an elf specific god eater, which if you're wondering about that, go watch that stream. You could run with the Arianka plot of that. There's something about her, like someone maybe finds one of the keys and unlocks a lock, or something happens where her case gets a crack in it and Morgur comes for her. That could literally be an entire roleplay campaign. But Morgur entering the city would be awful. It would be really, really bad, because you'd basically be throwing a spark onto a very, very, very dry patch of grass loaded with TNT.
I think it's also worth noting that you could very easily use Morgur to be one of the primary reasons the city is in the state that it's in. It would be very easy to say that Morgur passing through the city during the Great War Against Chaos, perhaps driven north at this point and then passing through, caused much of the horror that lies inside that city, because mutation and change pretty much follows in its wake.
Now, also, if you're ever using Morgur, Prague is a perfect example of what would happen to a place that he passes through.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I was rewriting it, I would be sorely tempted to do that. Sorely tempted, because it makes sense of much of what the city is, and it also gives Morgur a bigger impact upon the setting, because Morgur's impact is exceedingly small for a character who is exceedingly big. All he pretty much does is attack wood elves, and that's about it. And we don't really get the idea of the horror that comes in Morgur's wake. And if you say that horror, and you can see that stamped into Prague. What happened in Prague was because of Morgur. Suddenly, Morgur becomes something that's much more impressive, and you can understand much more immediately.
Gelto, I like that your art changes every single stream. You have dedication to that. I appreciate it.
I love
it. A mysterious beauty lies below the city. Guess who? It's not you. Dino Man. Sorry if this has already been answered, but when roughly was Prague settled by the Ungolls? It would have been a hot while ago.
Yeah, so the Ungolls are in the area before the Empire is founded. The Ungolls are one of the tribes that support Sigmar during the first battle for Blackfire Pass. They send in their horsemen, they come in, they sweep in against the Greenskins and harry their sides, and then eventually return to the lands of the Ungolls, which is up to the far northeast of the Empire. Now, at this point, they have already founded both Erengrad and Prague. Both of them already exist. Now, how big are those cities and when exactly were they founded is difficult to tell. But I think that we have a pretty strong indication that the Ungol settled in the area of modern-day Kislev about the same time that the various tribes of Sigmar arrived inside the Right Basin. So it's at a similar era. So we're probably talking anywhere from around about -1000 up to around about 0 as far as the imperial year strikes such things for being the foundation point of Prague and Erengrad.
Yeah, so Prague's probably been around for about 3,000 years, give or take.
Yeah, give or take.
Yeah.
There are older civilizations in the area. They're mentioned in a few sources, like the Scythians, as I mentioned beforehand, and they're somewhat similar to the Belfani. In terms of their impact on the local tribes. So they're an older tribe that was in the area beforehand, but the Ungolls pushed them back, and they're known for the old works that can be found, and many of them like almost megalithic, that can be found throughout Kislev.
Darius Rose, Frank Reynolds in Prague. Frank, Charlie, there's a ghostly undead broad pestering me about her story of her and her family being killed by chaos as I try and enjoy my rum-soaked Tuskor. Get a vacuum. You could, there would be something deeply, you could have a very good comic series that is like equally fucked up and hilarious about the people of Kislev or the people of Prague and them just dealing with the day-to-day bullshit of like seeing some horrific stuff but being like, I've seen it before. I've been here. That actually could make for a fairly good comedy series if you like a very dark form of comedy.
I'm going to bring up one of the comments that we've had along the way. Ooh, caught you live. Yay, glad you made it. Anyway, have they talked about Prague map? It has several problems. There's actually a bit of history with the Prague map, which is why I brought this one up.
Oh, okay, great.
The Prague map was made by Steve D. Steve D made his own version of Prague and built it up and did a very simple drawing of it. He drew it out himself, and I got a digital version sent over to me, and it's like, this is the Prague. I pinged over Games Workshop at the time, and I said, well, are you happy with this? There's certain things that perhaps contradict some of the other books. I just need to make sure that we are doing this. And they said, yep, that's what we want it to be. And I was like, great. So I built it according to Steve D's design. And as far as I was concerned, that was it. I hate most of the maps in the Kislev book, but that's only because I had a week and a half to do all of them. I had no time. There was no time to do anything else. So this, the Prague map in particular, has copy-paste bits in it that to this day upset me. I could actually probably bring up the Prague map if I presented. Let me just do that while I'm chatting. In fact, I'll do that afterwards so that Sotek can say some stuff. So I'll do it when I'm not talking. So when I got the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay for production job, I was in a position where I could hire some folks, and I needed an assistant developer. And I'd already hired someone called B. Sherry to do some writing for me, and they were the best. And I got talking to B. We discussed loads of things. Eventually, I brought B in as my assistant producer. So B was responsible for getting all the books that I was working on into a place where he could say, is this all right? Is that all right? And they could pretty much assist me. And then one day he went, hey, Andy. I said, yeah, you did the Prague map, didn't you? And I was like, yeah, man, that was a tight deadline. My favorite map in the world. I said, your favorite map? Really? Why? Personally, not my favorite map, but sure. Why? It's like, because I've got the original. And he pulled out Steve D's sketch that he'd done. I was like, what the heck? And they said, yep, I've got the original. I met Steve at a con because he was Australian also. Steve D's Australian, so is B. And said, I met Steve and I told him how much I loved his writing in the Kislev book. And Steve went, well, hey, and gave B the map. And that's kind of cool. So the original map out there exists somewhere and is owned currently by B. Sherry, which is really nice. So there's a little factoid about that map. Also, very cool. To respond directly to this one, if it has several problems, what problems do you perceive? If you bring them up in the comments, I might be able to answer to those.
Yes, yes, that would be a great thing to pop in the chat because that would be something I would actually be interested in tackling. Because I've seen, you're not the first person I've seen mention that in regards to the Prague stream. Like when we were doing the vote, people were like, oh, I hope they talk about the map. It's like, okay, what about the map? Morty, wait, vampire ice witches? Do spellcasters keep their powered when vamped? What if a life wizard were to go vamped? I've never thought about this. So,
yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah, generally, no. Especially when you're dealing with lores that come from a very particular source, like ice magic, which depending on who exactly you're looking at, vampires tend to, generally speaking, a lot of vampires tend to lose access to particular lores as they get overwhelmed by the dar that makes up what they are, which is why they tend to lean into more dark magic lores because it comes more naturally to them. But there are exceptions. There are like notably necrarchs out there that are capable of unleashing other kinds of lores. There have, yes, even been vampires able to wield the lore of life. They are very rare, but they do exist. I think it was the Forbidden Lore upgrade, which lets your vampires run away with battle lores. But an ice switch turning, I would be shocked if they were still able to use ice magic based on where it comes from.
Yeah, so the official answer to this would be no. If I was writing it, there would be a dark ice magic that they could use. because that's too fucking cool. The rule of cool generally always wins in Warhammer when you're writing. And how fucking cool would it be to have these twisted vampire ex-ice witches who had managed to tap through and corrupt the ice, the pure ice of Mother Kislev, and were doing their own dark rituals in an attempt to try and take over some Kislev nonsense. That's a cool story.
That's actually
do that.
Yeah, that's actually a good moment we're saying of something that I would encourage for y'all when you're thinking about lore and doing like the critical thinking we encourage here on Lorebeards is remember magic is not static. Magic is an evolving force. People are inventing new spells constantly. Like, sure, yeah, Nagash made a very potent lore, but Nagash was literally just a guy. There was nothing special about him when he created the lore of undeath. Like, there was literally nothing unique about him. He was just smart and combined some lores. The idea that you could come across a vampire who used to know, like, the lore of ice, and they would take all of this new dark magic and them create a new lore of magic would be extremely likely. Same thing with a life wizard. There's actually a note that a famous necromancer created the lore of Necroarboreacy, which was the lore of undead trees. Now, he immediately got eaten alive by the horrible monstrosities that he created, but because magic, when you're messing around with it, often goes terribly wrong. But because most people don't have their fail safes in place, but there are infinitely more technically lores of magic than you think exist. For the battle game, we have to keep things very simple and straightforward. But there are A, infinitely more spells than you think exist, and B, the winds can be combined and corrupted or heightened or simplified or broadened in very weird and bizarre ways. Don't ever get caught up on the idea of like, oh, I am a fire wizard and I only know the spells from Total War Warhammer. No, it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And this is a fine example of what I think would make for a great bloodline for the Kislev book, if there was to be another roleplay book, or a vampire book, if there's to be one, because Bloody Katerin has been around inside Warhammer lore since 1989. 1990, somewhere around there. It's an old piece of Kislev lore, and having that reflected through to the final version of what vampires are in Warhammer, I think would be great. And having her bloodline having access to this weird, corrupt, unique type of magic would be super cool. So I would have no problems at all with creating that. But it's worth noting, having said all of that, if we're just going with the rules as they currently stand, absolutely not.
Yep.
No.
yeah.
No.
In the role play, go for it. In the battle game, absolutely not. Don't you dare.
yeah, totally. But I think that there could be an exceedingly cool story built there. And it's generally from these weird edge places that we get sometimes some really cool shit hitting the big game itself. For example, the Vampire Coast was just a drop-off name, and we all know how that turned into an entirely new set of magic, pirate vampires, all manner of stuff, all from one word, vampire, attached to coast over in Lustria, and then someone effectively writing in extra details with each generation of the game, until eventually it got completely expanded out in White Dwarf with a quick, why don't we do something cool and different? And that got turned into something for Total War.
Yeah, and actually, in regards to your Life Wizard Go Vamp thing, Lore of the Deeps is actually a really fascinating thing to think about when you think about that, because the ocean is often thought of very much as like a place where a lot of Olgu and Gyren gathers, but not as much Shaish or Dar, but because they're vampires, they twist it into a new form of magic, which is the Lore of the Deeps that we have in Total War, which is a very unique expression of oceanmancy.
Yeah, totally. And Lore of Life is also capable of enervation, not just additional vitality. So it's not just about giving life to stuff. You can also draw life out of things. It's very, very close to necromancy. It's like Shaish is the Wind of Death, obviously very close to necromancy. Gyren is also surprisingly close to it.
Dwarf clan, the humans repaired the wall my clan built around Prague. Instead of hiring us to do it, that's a grudge. And that would actually make an excellent adventure hook if you're doing a Prague campaign. It's a dwarf clan showing up and being very irritated at like someone touching one of their walls, even though they took like 60 years to get there because dwarfs.
Yeah,
that would make for a good adventure hook.
Yep.
Man,
if you want to do it differently, it'd also make an interesting adventure hook if dwarves did that to other dwarves.
Yeah, that would be good.
It's always good to try and go beyond the standard stereotype. The stereotype here is humans do umgy stuff, dwarves come along afterwards and say you shouldn't be doing umgy stuff, as in the dwarf word for humans being umgy, shoddily made. And that's the stereotype, and it gets used again and again and again in various hooks, but sometimes it's worth looking at and saying, how can I twist that? And if dwarves are commissioned to do a particular job, and it's impossible to see who built these walls now, they're so twisted and broken, they have to be basically taken down, new rock shipped in from wherever, or in this case, maybe not shipped in, literally carried across wherever it is they're coming from, cargoed in, let's say, and then rebuilt. And then another dwarf clan arriving, finding the walls of their ancestors have been removed by a different clan, and then it turning into a proper stalemate where neither allows the continuation of the walls to be built. On one side, I've started this, I will not back down. The other side saying, this is our wall, I will not allow you to continue. And we have ourselves a big problem. Two dwarf clans, neither of whom are now working.
That is a
stubborn nature. Really would take a lot of time to get over. That'd be fun.
That is such a perfect place to throw in a roleplay party of some boyar being like, please find a way to end this. I don't care how you do it, just find a way.
Particularly if you're playing close to the end times, or if you're playing, for example, a campaign that passes through Kislev in winter or early spring. In spring, you get the spring drivings, and the spring drivings are basically chaos hordes from the north making an attempt to push down into Kislev. And I say chaos hordes, it's often just Norse warbands. But hordes from the north come down and attack. And come spring, those walls should be solid. And if it's early spring and the dwarves are squabbling and not building, it's becoming now a matter of time to get them up, lest something big comes. Particularly if they then hear that across Blackblood Pass, a relatively large force of maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Norse are coming. They've already passed Fort Stragov, and they've ignored Fort Stragov, and they're driving hard for Kislev. Suddenly, not Kislev, for Prague. Suddenly, Prague's on a high alert, and you've got this wall that's just not being built, and that makes for a fun hook.
Man, it's just a note. It does seem kind of odd that Mazda wants all the humans back to the old world when the overwhelming amount of lore has tribes migrating to the old world, not the. So this kind of falls under. I think we actually mentioned this in the Mazda stream, that the term "old world" can be very misleading, and it can be much bigger than it initially appears. Take it with a hefty grain of salt.
So I'll answer that one specifically. The tribes come from two primary areas. One is the north, where they were dragged up there by Be'lakor, who had surrounded himself by countless millions of worshippers, mostly humans, many of which elevated to Demon Prince, and he was the Demon Prince, king of them all, effectively a fifth chaos power ruling at the northern gate. So this is back during the Cataclysm. And then you had the people of the old world. The old world, generally speaking, the humans' original place seems to be either close to Nehekara itself, possibly the Southland, somewhere around there, and there was migrations of humans from there. So humans, during the Cataclysm, were in the old world. Many went north to where Be'lakor was, and then migrated south again and came across the World's Edge Mountain as the migrating tribes from the north. Then we have the ones that came from Nehekara, Southlands or whatever, who migrated north into the area of the Empire, but there are humans there already. So the story that you're pitching, that humans seems to have come from elsewhere, is not quite true. The humans were always in the old world. It's just different tribes of humans, either coming from the old world to a different part or coming from the north where they have been taken, probably by Be'lakor.
Rick Scotty, back on dry land in time to see the Neandy. Because you have Neandy.
Completely agree. And also, I am feeling super poorly today, so apologies if I'm just rambling or saying nonsense most of the time.
No, you're doing great. And welcome back to dry land. Walking Tree, I'm imagining an old Cap driver in Prague who just constantly goes, "Yeah, I've seen shit." It has a good story for every side lane in the city. Oh yeah.
That would make a super fun little NPC that a group of characters could meet again and again as they're being taken from one place to the next in their handsome cab equivalent, pulled by a pony or maybe 2 ponies as they're sitting in the back. And yeah, he has definitely seen some shit. Definitely. I think that would be a super fun character.
Yeah, that you could actually have a good scene in the party, like being mad at him for not warning them about a thing in an alley. And he's like, if you want me to warn you about every dangerous thing in the city, we will be here forever. Figure it out. Darius, did the Gospodars know the Kurgan are related to them? Same with any other peoples? Do they just think of the northern tribes as horrible monsters from the north? Or do the people of the south know they can turn to chaos just like their distant relatives?
They're humans. I mean, it's like saying, do the people of the Empire know that the humans that are coming from the north are human? They're all human. All the tribes of humanity are human. And the primary source of meat, shall we say, for the grinding mills of the Chaos armies are human. And is it noted by all the species of the world that humanity is the primary force of chaos? Yes. Why do you think the High Elves are so suspicious of the Empire, Bretonia, et al.? It's because humanity fell big time. Humanity is the core component of the chaos forces that are material. Humanity plus monsters. And that's just the truth of it. Now, do Kislevites know that lots of other tribes of humans have fallen and are likely to attack them? Yeah. Are they humans? Yeah.
Yeah, I would also add to this, keep in mind that at the end of the day, they're still human, and humans, as we know, tend to struggle very much with a mental system of the others, so us versus them. Humans have a lot of pride in where they're from, but if you ask people in our world, like, hey, do you know that you're technically from related, though distantly, and you're basically the same as people over in X whatever country? They say, no, I'm a such and such, fuck you. There's a lot of people like that. A lot of people have a very humans don't have very good long-term memory and don't tend to do a very good job thinking about the big scope of things. They tend to think in a very small decades scope, not a centuries or millennia scope.
I think that's very fair. I mean, take, for example, just me. Hi, I'm Andy. I'm the problem. It's me. If I was just to look at myself, would say I'm Scottish. I was born in Scotland. My dad born in England, but came from a family that had been all over the place. My mum born in Scotland too. I'm Scottish. But if you look into my family tree, you can go back to all the royalty of Europe. I've got heavy Scandinavian roots. I've got heavy Polish roots, right the way back to the emperors of Constantinople. I've got that blood in me as well. Various Scottish kings I've got in me too. I'm human. I have access to, through my bloodline, pretty much peoples from across Europe. There's French people in there. There is lots. It's just one big giant melange of blood. So I'm related to all of them, really. Probably I've got Genghis Khan in there somewhere because, pretty much everybody does. Yeah, we're all interrelated, but ultimately I'm Scottish.
Yeah, and I'll put it this way. Think about just in a city of that the nobles are technically not at all different and are often directly related to the peasants.
Dude, that's what you took from all of that.
Right, shut up.
Far more Scandinavia is worth noting. But then, hey, Normandy was basically Scandinavia in France. But yeah.
That's
interestingly, not Welsh. I'm not aware of much Welsh in my bloodline, it's worth noting. Quite a lot of English, but I'm not aware of much Welsh. But as is often the case, my wife, Lindsay, she's done all of the looking into that because she found out that I was literally a descendant of some of her favorite historical characters. I call them characters like they're special characters with magical swords, but some of her favorite characters, I'm like descended through a route to various Scottish kings and queens that she loved.
So we've just learned the real reason she married Andy.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, quite.
But yeah, I mean, just think about how nobles genuinely think that they are almost another species compared to the commoner, despite the fact there is literally no difference between them other than a slightly altered group of ancestors. But eventually, they're going to tie back to the same people.
I'll draw it back another line as well, and one that's slightly uncomfortable to discuss, but I do think is worth actually highlighting, and I say it's uncomfortable to discuss because it starts othering certain races of humanity, but there is more in common with a Kislevite and most of the northern tribes than there is with Cathayans, because Cathayans look different. Elves look different. They're almost, to some humans, like a different species because they have completely different physiological looks, particularly when you look at the facial constructions. Now, in the Kislev that I built, the Ungolds have got very similar features to many of the Cathayan bloodlines as well. But there is more in common with often the tribes to the north than there is with the local, than with other humans who are considered to be good. So yeah, be aware, it's all one big messy melange. A Cathayan person to an average human might not even be perceived as human, just perceived as a different species, because we're in a world where there are different loads of different sentient species, and some of them can interbreed because Cathayans can interbreed with, for example, folk from the Empire. But it's a complicated thing, and I think it's worth noting that for people in the Warhammer world, it's much weirder and more difficult when it comes to race issues than it is in the real world, because we also have species issues where in the Warhammer side. It's a big melange of difficulty.
Christopher says, I agree. Ice magic is almost by definition cool.
I see what you did there.
Jonathan Scott, the first record of vodka is from 1174, which translated over to Warhammer Fantasy Battle means that vodka should predate the foundation of Kislev. They stole Oslin's culture. Well, it might have. Well, I'm curious where Kvass would have probably actually originated from. I imagine the Ungolds would have made it, but it could have been the Ostlanders or the tribes of the Ostlanders.
That is a question that is not answered.
Interesting one.
The Kumis. So Kumis comes from the Ungolds. Kvass comes from the Gospodars. And yeah.
I mean, the Gospodars did conquer a good chunk of the Eastern Empire when they first came down.
Yeah. So I definitely think there's something in this that could potentially be elaborated upon later.
Avini DK, speaking of the undead, there are certain types of natural undead like ghouls. Are there any that are native to Kislev? Yes. So if you ever read The Realm of the Ice Queen, they've got like a bestiary section, and there is a unique form of undead at Kislev, which are actually really fucking spooky, which are called the eyeless ones.
Yeah.
And basically, so because Kislev is far north and it's got all sorts of fun problems, the dead don't always rest easy there. So oftentimes, especially in winter, when somebody dies, the ground is too hard to dig, and fire is a rare resource in a lot of parts of Kislev, so they don't want to waste it on burning bodies. So what they'll do is they will take out the eyes of a corpse and take it really, really far away from the settlement and basically dump it somewhere far out in the Oblast. The reason they do that is because oftentimes the body gets up. It's undead. And so, but they take the eyes out so it can't see. So it just wanders stumbling around through the Oblast. And there are all these notes about how the eyeless ones are a really sinister form of undead because they're not truly sentient. You know, they're kind of like ghouls in that they're lesser than a full thinking human, but they have enough sentience that they're essentially a predator species where they call out for help. They call out asking if someone's there. Can you help me? Please, I'm lost. Like they're almost mimicking certain aspects of what a person would say to try and lure you in. And if you get too close to them, they attack you, and they are very dangerous. They're a lot stronger than you would think they are. And in most stories, if they get you, if you're lucky, they'll just rip out your eyes and take it for themselves, and then they will wander off to go do probably horrible, nightmarish, undead things. And you are left with your eyes ripped out and stumble your way back to civilization, which is why Kislev actually has a really interesting culture of do not help strangers on the road. Don't stop. Keep going. And it's not because they're assholes. It's because it's dangerous, and that person calling for help might not be a person.
Yeah, 100% true. The land of Kislev is spiritually active in a way that the land of, say, the Empire is much, much less so. And Mor, the god of death, is not well regarded in most of Kislev. There's really there's very few temples of Mor. One in, for example, Kislev City. And in Kislev City, Mor is relatively well regarded, but even there, particularly for those who are staunch traditionalists, they're dead. They definitely are not buried within the city walls. They're taken outside for those who take Morian routes towards a garden of Mor. But many of them are just strapped onto a horse, which is kicked off into the Oblast, never to be seen again, particularly if they're rich. And those who aren't, their bodies are just carted out into the middle of nowhere and put with their eyes plucked out into the snow face down. And the reason their eyes are plucked out is so they can't find anyone when they stir. And that's horrible. So if they should stir, they will not be able to find you because they're blind. They don't think that Mor is a god that is of much interest to them. Now, culturally speaking, this is because of the Gospodar influence upon them, where the dead were very much not something they worried about. They're a northern tribe with their own rituals, but they have been strongly influenced in the south by Ostermark, where Mor is almost the core deity of that grand province, or at least is at the moment until they rewrite it. Mor is strongly influencing the south, which is why there is temples in, for example, Kislev City. But up in Prague, it's just not the case. There is no great temples of Mor.
Yep, and it is worth one thing that's also fun to think about the eyeless ones, and particularly creepy to think about the eyeless ones, is that you'd think they'd just kind of be like regular zombies, which don't talk, but eyeless ones do talk, which seems to indicate that it's not just Dar reanimating the corpse that stumbles around on base animal instincts. There's a sentience behind it, which I would suggest is probably a spirit puppeting a body, which is really bad. That is bad. It can be very bad.
I'm going to give a counter view to that, but when we answer another question that I know is coming up.
That's fair. Donovan, speaking of magic, given how the lores of yin and yang are kind of like high magic, but only harnessing half the 8 winds, do you think there are ways to harmonize the other combinations into other lores? I would say yeah. I don't see why not. Mix your colors.
I would say that there is no limit to how magic can be split or recategorized. For the battle game, it is always going to be simplified into the same core shapes, because the more complication you add, the harder it is to have a single rulebook cover it all. But in terms of the reflection of that in the Warhammer world, there's always going to be someone who's doing it different or over the next horizon.
There you go. Mr. Grubbler, cultural appropriation mentioned. If you were to use the Warhammer bits of Pygmy to create a new faction, what other inspiration would you use? Divine Tin, Ritual Cannibals, Self-Mutilation, Alien Survivor. The Pygmies are kind of one of those things where the source is so fucked up that I just really wouldn't want to touch them at all. I wouldn't even want to salvage them. I'd rather make something new. Especially because the Pygmies don't make sense where they were put, because the Pygmy culture in our world is an African concept, not a South American concept. So I don't know why they're in Lustria, but they are. So if I was going to replace them in Lustria, I would do something completely different, based on actual, I would actually work on cultures that are from those regions. And if I did something in Africa, I'd rather build something new based on like really famous grand empires, like the Zulu Empire.
Yeah. Okay, so first, Games Workshop's old Pygmies are awful. They just use lots of racist stereotypes, and they're just weird. If we were doing something for Lustria, you wouldn't use real-world Pygmy peoples as any sort of source anyway. It makes no sense. If you're looking at building something that would have come out of, say, a Warhammer equivalent of the Congo or something like that, then yes, there are things that we could not only salvage, we could use, but you would have to do it well. And as it currently stands, it's not only been done badly, it's been done almost hilariously badly. It's funny in a horrific way, because it's really, really not well done. There was no ill intent intended, because it was the 80s and they were just making stuff that they thought was cool. It was blindly racist without any awareness of what they were doing. And once the writers who were involved realized, often significantly later, what they had made, the actual shame many of them felt was significant because they were blind to their own prejudices at the time. So yes, of course, there's always things you could do, but I think in this case, it's a clear example of where we should start with a tabula rasa, a nice clean slate, and start from the beginning. But Games Workshop absolutely shouldn't shy away from creating Lustrian, Southland, human cultures because they're afraid of what was made before. That fear of not doing something because it might be perceived as racist, in many respects, is even more racist because you end up with no black people or no South American culture people at all in your setting. None. Because you're so afraid of making them.
Sense.
How
they built the world. It doesn't make sense.
It's more racist. Because you end up with cultures where you only ever mention them once at a distance, but you never use them, and man, ends up leaving all the miniatures white is bullshit.
Yep. Reiki Scotty, I love the placing of Prague in Total Warhammer 3, as I often consolidate there before any further pushes. How accurate is that placement? How does its placement in the world practically anchor the Kislev defense line? So it's relatively close. I think it might be. No, it's actually quite close.
No, it's pretty good.
Yeah, funny enough, Hell Pit is actually in a weird placement compared to where it's shown on most maps. Hell Pit's usually actually depicted a bit further to the east than it is on the Total War map. But Hell Pit's placement is also not consistent, depending on which maps you look at. How does its placement in the world practice? Yeah, I mean, we've spoken a lot about that. It was not necessarily intended to be the bastion against chaos on the north, but it is. When a chaos invasion is coming, everyone in the northern oblast, every single one of the peoples flee to Prague. And Prague, it's talked about how in the healthier parts of the year, where there's no threat of chaos invasion imminent, parts of the city are kind of empty because they're literally just meant as refugee quarters that are dedicated for that purpose, which is pretty fascinating. The city has a built-in fail-safe for refugees.
Yeah, the Prague originally was this great fortress city that was maintained by the Ungals, so that when war came, they had somewhere to retreat to. It wasn't originally the great fixed bastion city that we have now. In many respects, it was the walls that they fell back to as all the horses retreated before whatever incoming forces may be coming, drop behind the walls, wait for them to pass normally, and then sweep back to their old settlements again. The Ungals didn't have cities and towns in the way that we recognize them today, particularly in its past. They had a couple of cities. They had the big port city of Ehrengrad. They had maybe Bolgazgrad, although that again appears to be a relatively new formation post the arrival of the Gospodars. And they had, obviously, Prague. And Prague in particular looks like its foundation point was probably as a bastion that was often empty. Not empty completely, but mostly empty. It's where the horses retreated to, with all the Ungals with them. So it has always been a focal point for the defense of the north of what is now called Kislev.
Nibble, if humans come to the Southlands, why does it seem like Crusaders and Albion were taught directly by the Old World? So not all humans come to the Southlands. Many do, but
Old World.
Yeah, Old World is a broad term. But yeah, the people of Albion have been there for a crazy long time and have connections back to the old ones.
So to be clear, one more time, the human foundation point is in the Old World. One of them is probably near or close to Nehekara. One of them is probably near or close to Albion. Another one is probably near or close to the Empire. It's possible that the Belfani folk are the same folk that were in Albion. And personally, I think that's definitely the case. So we're looking at a few locations in the Old World where humans once were. And they then moved outwards and spread. Some of them spread to the north, others moved, and then started swarming into different areas over the course of time.
Dynaman, so in reference to the eyeless ones, why don't we just chop them into pieces then?
Okay, Glenn, this is the one I was referring to earlier, because there is, particularly amongst the Ungals, a deep believing in helping the spirits of the land, and you're returning your people to the land. You take them far away from your Stanista or your Krug or your circle of people or whatever else it might be, and you return the people to the land. To cut them up would be to disrespect the spirits and to disrespect the body. This is not something that you do. They don't need more. More is somebody else's job. They've got their own spirits that deal with this stuff. And if you cross the spirits, they will come back and they will haunt you. And to ensure that that doesn't cause much issue, the one thing they do is pluck out the eyes for those who are inhabited by a bad spirit. Should a bad spirit come that's looking to do something, or if the person themselves died in a particular way, then means that their spirit doesn't pass on properly, which means you'll never be able to find never be able to find those who've crossed you. Now, when the Gospodars came in, they had no death traditions because they're a Northern Chaos tribe. They arrive with zero death tradition, and they basically just adopt what the Ungals had been doing previously, largely to mix in with, because they're a great amalgam of cultures anyway, and possibly because of some influence from Mother Kislev, the Great Widow, whatever you want to call it. And they also adopted, particularly in the south, many of the cultural touchstones from Ostermark, which came to, loosely speaking, Morian respect in the south of Kislev. So you'll find it's a mixture of death practices of the Ungals and death practices of the Empire that have been picked up by Kislev. But from the Ungal perspective, it's all about spirits. And in this case, to kill and chop up the body would be to disrespect those spirits and that person that you've just chopped up. That's just not the thing that you do.
Yeah, you have to remember that in the Warhammer world, practicality means a different thing because of the nature of the gods and magic. There are literal forces in the world that watch over the process of death, and desecrating the dead has consequences.
Yeah, especially you're going to get haunted, because there's going to be, in the Warhammer world, it is expressly the case that your body is a part of your soul. So letting it rot away and diminish in its own time is a core component of ensuring that you don't get haunted by its ghost.
Rick Scotty's Thraltsi are famously strong in Total War Warhammer 3 with their dual-purpose weaponry, their hilarious gun axes. Does the state fund their soldiery with such standard-issue weapons, or is that a jury-rigged soldier thing the troops do of their own accord? So
this, good question, Ricky. The Thraltsi were originally added into Warhammer, and it's a direct lift pretty much from real world in Mordheim. And in Mordheim, they were a special troop of Erengrad, and that's it. So when I was doing Realm of the Ice Queen, I copy-pasted from Mordheim and added in the Thraltsi, not the same way that they're presented in Total War, and they were a core troop component of Erengrad. In the forces that we were allowed to mess around with for Kislev, we weren't allowed to use much in the way of cannon or gunpowder weaponry at all, and the Thraltsi were the only ones we were allowed. And at that point, their bardishes, their axes, were used as driven into the ground and used to hold their long guns. So they put it into the curve of the axe and use that to hold. And the Thraltsi version that we get in the old world is an incredibly impractical weapon that makes no sense at all when you think about it.
I will open a little bit of backroom talk for you about so the thing with the Thraltsi is that if you're an animator and you're like, I need a melee and a ranged animation for this unit, it is much more complex to have a halberd wielding unit that plants their halberd in the ground, puts the gun on the halberd and fires it, than to simply give them a weapon that is both a gun and a melee weapon. And technically, there are museums that have weird hybrid melee gun weapons that have been made by people in our world.
There are, but not like that. The weapon they made is back to front. It makes almost no sense.
But it's cool looking and easy to animate.
It absolutely is. And they also, in that version, spread it around. It's no longer just an Erengrad. At that point, it was just Erengrad that had it. And when Total War picked it up, it gets spread across Kislev. You can pretty much pick them up any old place. So there you go. They've long been a part of Warhammer pretty much since the late 90s. I imagine when they redo Kislev, they'll just be a core component of all of Kislev.
Yeah, and I was based on the way Total Wars kind of handle it, I would guess that in the cities where we're seeing a lot more black powder, Kislev has a lot of black powder in Total War. It's probably going to be that the city factions are very heavily funded by their cities, with the great black powder revolution that they seem to be leaning into, which is going to be really interesting to see how the old world handles that, because I think traditionally in the old lore, black powder didn't really show up in any force until after Tsar Alexei kind of survived the war against of the Great War and was like, "Oh, we need gunpowder."
Not true. It's not true. That every source contradicts. For example, Mordheim had gunpowder in Kislev all the way back at Mordheim time, which is 500 years ago. Which was why when I gave a quick ping saying, "What can I do with the black powder Kislev things?" and got, "You can't. There is none in Kislev. Look at the army list that was created by Gav Thorpe, and indeed they've got Kislev horse archers and similar. There is no black powder in that army list." I was left with, well, but they've had it for 500 years, surely. I mean, the walls are lined with cannons. Surely I can use them. No, you can't. So I was left having to hodgepodge it together in a fashion that made sense. Now that the Total War came along and they basically made much more sense of parts of that, I think that the modern version of Kislev will take all of that on board, and black powder will be a part of Kislev for quite some time.
Yeah, because Old World Kislev's going to have a lot of boom.
Sure.
Ricky Chapman, a Wolfram game, we helped Prague fight a Nurgle warband, got competitive with some wicked lancers who could kill more than we. Turns out a grudge raker on the back of a chariot is very effective at killing. Yeah, most guns via chariot is going to have a pretty devastating effect. So yeah, that would do it. Diamond, I imagine that pre-Gospodar of Kislev was kind of similar to the Khazar Khaganate, a vast stretch of land inhabited by mostly nomadic people with a few core cities and fortresses like Sarkel, Samander, Balanjar, and Atil.
I think that this is sort of the case in that the great rotas of winged lancers were supposed to be Gospodar only. At least that's what they were originally, because that's what the Gospodar brought with them. The winged lancers that they were... the source of the winged lancers was in the chaos centers of the north, and that was definitely an idea. The original Gospodars, when they came in, were a nomadic group of people, and the cities that they then took from the Ropsmen, from the Frykings, from the Ungals, were adopted, and they took them on board because they had been effectively summoned from the north by Kislev. The land itself had summoned them, the ancient widow, if you will, and Mother Kislev and her ice magics were their new toy to play with. And I think your description of how Kislev could be described sort of works, but in the last 1,000 years, Kislev has been settled and has developed culturally. The Gospodars in particular are far more of a settled group where they have towns.
He did say pre-Gospodar.
Okay, then, yes, I think, yeah, you're right. I missed the pre-bits. So that being the case, yeah.
Yep. What would you call the god of pierogies? I don't fucking know, Hammond. What? I'm sure the answer will be riveting. So, in the interest of time...
I have a question. What's a pierogi?
It's a type of food. I'm
going to go check it out, because I don't know.
Yeah, it's like it's a type of dumpling.
Oh, so nice. I'm just looking at it just now. Where's it from? Poland. Ah, there you go. Makes sense for why it's here.
Yes. So I don't know, Hammond. Hammond, do you have like a?
It's probably Daz. I'm looking at it because Dad is the sun god, who's also the god of the hearth and the god of keeping things in. So yeah, probably Daz.
There you go. I feel like Hammond probably has a punchline that Andy just circumvented with actual lore. But so in the interest of time, we're going to get on to kind of the last thing, which is the thing I really want to talk about.
We have 20 minutes left.
I know. One of the things that I find really interesting to consider is what the effects of the changes to Kislev would have had on Prague if it had received a lore update in the era of Karl Franz. The big one that really jumps out at me is the Great Orthodoxy. Because the Great Orthodoxy, for pride, religious, and political reasons, would probably have a deep interest in reclaiming Prague. And I imagine would be a significant force there. This united state religion that is the combining of the cults. And we've talked about this a lot. If you go check out our previous streams where we talk about Kislev and its rework within Total War and the implications of that, of which there are a lot. And one of the things we talk about a lot of the Great Orthodoxy is that it introduces this really fascinating thing of the Great Orthodoxy is not friendly to the Ungol people because it is a very state-sponsored, codified version of the various cults, which many of which were not intended to be worshipped that way. Now, Tsar Boris had good intentions of trying to make the cults less more resistant to like chaos infiltration, and make it where people were able to understand them easier, and that there was like there was more transparency. But Prague, I think this would have been such a fascinating dynamic for Prague, because in a mostly Ungol dominated city that would need the support of something like the Great Orthodoxy, who would be very well designed to deal with a lot of Prague's issues, the cultural strife the Great Orthodoxy would probably cause in the city would be crazy.
Yeah, I kind of agree. When you look at how the lore has been updated for Kislev, there's going to be some significant changes that would need to be made to make Prague sort of make sense. The religious aspects inside Kislev would need to be readdressed. There is, for example, a gigantic Temple of Daz sitting in the northeast of the city. The Temple of Ursun, by comparison, is tiny, really small, and only has a single priest who's in absentium, as I recall. And that would all be wrapped up in the new orthodoxy that is coming in, and that would not go down frightfully well with many of the local Ungols also. Also, what do we do with some of our lesser gods, and how do they get wrapped up into it as well? Because I'd like to see that, particularly given that Salyak is pretty much has, as I recall, a single mercy house sitting inside the city, and that's it. So
she's got a pretty big elevation, thanks to Total War being one of the big four.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting to see how that would be repitched. I think it's also fair to say that the entire city would be different. It would be manned in a very different fashion. The rotas of warriors and where they come from would be different. The internal structure of the city would be different because we've got black powder weaponry all over the place. The height of the weirdness of the magic would probably be re-stressed. We need to have cannons perched on the walls of the old city that lies on the inside, because Prague has an old city on the inside of it. In fact, why don't I just bring up the old map? Because I was going to say I was going to do that earlier.
Boy, here we go.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you've got the old city that's in the center. And this is my original map that I drew back in about 2 days. So I could literally edit that and call it, say, for example, the new town. Look at that. Oh. Because it's the original, but I've got rid of that. So yeah, you can see it's got the big fortress up at the top by the Square of Kisses, and we've got the new town, which is a big massive tangle of it's a shanty town basically. The old town in the center with the original all the original walls from the very first Prague still largely in place. The new external walls all the way around the outside. Our west side over there, the merchant quarters down in the south, which is where our Cathane districts and similar are. The ogres are over on the side over to the far left. The new palace is up there. There's an old palace number 13 there, which I just zoom into very quickly. That's where it used to be ruled from by the Ungols, and that also used to be on the inside of the walls, but it got rebuilt. And yeah, we've got all sorts of cool stuff. A noble quarter over here on top of another hill.
Swinsman, a lot of when you get a bunch of Warhammer fans that look at a map and they say, "Oh, this is bad," they usually mean that it doesn't line up with previous depictions.
And from my perspective, I'll show you why it's bad. Things that bug me. Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Look at that little curved house right in the middle. I'm over it with my mouse. I'm not sure if you can see that. So I'm going to circle it. Let me just cancel. I'll need to make a new layer so I can do this. So let's add a layer. Oh, wait a minute. I'm also going to do something else. I think I've got Steve D's original map. So wait a minute.
What is going on with that?
There?
Yeah, what is going on with that?
Look at that house here.
There's all... Oh, huh.
Wait, what? What? There's two of the same house? I could only do this in literally a day and a half. I had no time to draw them all. Wait, what? There's three of the same house. Yeah, I ran out of time. So the north of the city is copy-pasted. I hate that.
That is genuinely super funny.
I had no time to fix it. I had the deadline, the map had to be handed over in the next day, and I hadn't drawn any of the northern map. And if you've ever drawn a map using this sort of style, it takes ages because every line is drawn by hand. I ran out of time, so sadly, the north section of the city has copy-paste errors all over the place, which I despise with a heavy passion. That really bugs me. I also, though, I think I have... Look at that. The original map by Steve D.
That's so funny.
That's the one that I was mentioning earlier that B. Sherry owns. B gave us. B got given that, pardon me, by Steve. And this is a perfect example of the sort of stuff that I would normally be given if I was working on.
That is so adorable. That's so funny.
I actually love this. It's just
like
the best.
You like walk into like an elementary school and be like, "Oh, look at this lovely map someone drew." Colored in with crayons.
Yeah,
but it works.
So I obviously have issues with this map because it includes many copy-paste sections that I dislike because I much prefer everything to be entirely unique. But nevertheless, I'm still rather happy with this map because it even exists in the first place. Because we hadn't had one before that. And if I have the original for Erengrad, I'll show you the. I've got Erengrad 2. That's probably the original. Let's bring that up as well while I'm here. Let's get rid of that. So this is the Erengrad map where there is no copy-paste errors. This one was drawn by hand all the way through, and I much prefer it because of that. The nice little. Erengrad in this version had recently been sacked and was getting half rebuilt, and was a very strange version of the city. It's not how I would have written it.
Because it's post-Storm of Chaos, yeah.
It's post-Storm of Chaos, exactly. It's a proper mess. And yeah, it's quite fun, but that's an entirely hand-drawn one, which I prefer. But I still, if I'm being honest, don't like it for Erengrad. The Erengrad that David Chart wrote is not the Erengrad that I would have written. But yeah, there you go. Let's get rid of that. That was a fun little aside. That is Prague.
Yeah. So we have an honest question from Hammond. Why is the name of Ungol so similar to Ungor? Is there any kind of relation here? What is the similarity between the words?
None. No relation. It's just two words. Literally none. The Ungol have been kicking around as a name for quite a long time, like about 20 years. The Ungor, about the same time, actually. Yeah, the Ungor about the same time. And it's just the lesser Gore. That's all Ungor are. It's just the lesser Gore. And the Ungols are just a human tribe. There is no direct relation between the two of them. They just sound similar. It's a coincidence.
There you go. Don man, the program question made me think, do you think Kislev has cabbage rolls? They're a common food across Eastern Europe, which basically have cabbage leaves rolled up, stuffed with meat, onions, etc. Yeah. It's kind of like an Eastern European cabbage burrito. I would say that's probably likely.
Almost definitely, yeah. Almost anything that you find in the real world Eastern Europe has been added to Kislev at some point, because Kislev is this weird place that's not fantasy Russia. It's fantasy everything, but some writers forget that and just make it fantasy Russia. But even the Winged Lancers, clearly not fantasy Russia, fantasy Poland and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's a bit of a mess, is Kislev.
Ricky Scotty, thank you very much. Prague is famously cursed. That extends to the walls. The walls are also magically fortified. Can you go into detail about the challenges ice witches face weaving their defensive magics despite the walls being cursed, less saturated, and dark? So we've talked a little bit about how magic casting in Prague is a bitch. Because Prague is so fucked up. I mean, if you go look at the old Realm of Kislev book, there's literally a sidebar that says casting spells in Prague. And it talks about how using magic is really, really dangerous for everybody, whether it's the ice witches, the hags, wizards trained in the colleges, elven wizards, everyone. You really do not want to cast magic in Prague unless you have, like, it's life or death, or you have no other choice, because the city is so corrupt that that presence of chaos adds in a factor to your spell casting that cannot be easily controlled, and is more likely to take the spell you're trying to weave and pull at its threads, which causes the spell to go awry.
Yes, to all of that. The city is saturated with magic. And that makes it very easy for spells to go wrong. The ice witches are not responsible largely for the holding of the walls. There's almost no ice witches in the city at all. As its first, in its actual description, it says there's none, not one. They just avoid the place because it's so saturated with bad magics. The hags are in place, assuming that hags even become a thing in later editions, where I hope they will. The hags are there, but they tend to live outside the city because it's dangerous. Most of the new versions of the wards will probably be, again, reinforcement with dwarf runes, as their old walls have been repurposed, rebuilt, and slowly but surely the ancient wards that were put in place hundreds, if not thousands of years earlier by the dwarfs are reinstalled step by step by step until eventually we hit the end times and it all goes down again.
Mm. Hammond, would the minor gods get a Warhammer equivalent to turn them into a saint if we can use them? Akin to Saint Brigid from Ireland.
Yeah, it doesn't really quite work like that in Hammond. You can't just turn them into something to do with your deity because, bluntly, they're gods. It doesn't matter what you might try and impose upon them. They are gods, and they will get pissed. You don't fuck around with gods. You don't go, so this little god over here who is a god of merchants, actually it's a reflection of Urson, and we're going to call it now Bob the Bear Merchant. Yeah, that'll do, as then you're cursed. As that god is exceedingly pissed for what you've done. You can't just simply sanctify them and turn them into a saint of your particular religion just because that suits you politically.
Yeah, the gods are,
but it will not work.
The gods are sentient. They pay attention, especially if you're invoking them in any way, shape, or form. And they don't take well to people not paying them respect, would be the best way to put it.
Yeah, although some gods don't want respect because the gods are fickle. You know,
True.
They're a mess. You know, when it comes to etheric entities, which these things are, they're etheric entities of pure something. And whatever that something is, they are going to do. And if you come along and try to say, actually, you're something else instead, you will receive the wrath of that god. And wrath of the gods is a very real thing in the Warhammer world.
Listen, Chris, the Where's Waldo / Wally of Prague find all the copy-pasted houses.
Yeah, there are a few in the north, to which I am constantly sad. It's also worth noting that this map, like many maps, has a copy of my house in it. Because it was a common thing for me, whichever house I was living in at that moment, to include a copy of my house seen from above in it. So there's a copy of my house in Ehrengrad in Prague, but not in Kislev city, because that map is rubbish. I had no time to do that map at all, much like the Prague map. Ran out of time, so I did a very poor version of what that map could be.
Mr. Grumbler, I mean, without the real world part, without any real world parts, no pygmies, no tribes, no lustria, no blacks, any of that stuff. Once I tried that for AOS, these guys have more in common with punks and people living in diaspora.
Sure.
I
mean, that would be one way of potentially doing it, but I don't think I would have no black people. That would be weird.
Yeah. Hagen, thank you for the...
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Chapter Graham, what's with kvass and vodka being conflated in Warhammer Fantasy?
They shouldn't be.
Yeah, probably people that don't drink much of either, but are having to write about it.
Absolutely. It's written from a place of cultural ignorance. And I literally shouted at someone about this. I didn't shout. I wrote in full caps, please stop doing this. That's the equivalent of me shouting. It's just a thing. It's one of the reasons why whenever you're writing with elements of other people's cultures, you need to have, at the very least, sensitivity readers, people from those cultures to read it and say, dude, you've made these two things this. That makes no sense. They're different. And that's something that many a writer just simply doesn't have. And it upsets me. One of the reasons I think it's important to do that is that it avoids that sort of nonsense.
Yeah, and just to be clear, because I know people, I've seen people like this. They hear the term sensitivity writer, they go, I want books. It's literally just a person that makes sure you know what the fuck you're talking about when you hand off the piece of paper to them, where you go, I don't really know this, but it's important to the thing I'm writing. Can you make sure I don't sound like an idiot? And they go, yeah, okay, you're good.
I'll go further than that. It's not just I don't know about this, because often the writer at hand, who could be extraordinary, incredibly well read on the subject, will just write something a bit wrong. It's not even I don't know. You might be almost an expert. You write it out beautifully. You send it off. But somebody who comes from that area can say, oh, you made a small mistake here. That thing here should actually be called this instead. You've done a spelling error there. So a sensitivity reader is a core component of any writing of this ilk. And is certainly something that I always push for whenever this sort of work is being done.
Yeah, it's to make sure that when someone doesn't read, or when someone reads your book, they don't post online going, this person's a fucking idiot because they talked about this like it was this, so clearly they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. You can avoid that so easily.
So easy.
Hammond, Prague needs liberty from chaos. Looks like a job for American Volkmar. No, Volkmar, no. American, no. No. Sigmarite. I'm funny. Sigmarites. This is kind of interesting. So Warhammer has an issue at times, which is that because it's very empire centric, a lot of the writings that Games Workshop has done, a lot of the games and stuff, it gives the illusion that the Sigmarites are like a global power or like a much bigger power than they are. When even within the empire itself, they're a major power, but they're not the major power. They're a major power.
Yeah, they are a major power.
And they have zero fucking influence outside of the Empire at all.
Yeah. The Grand Theogenist is probably the most powerful man in the Empire, more so than the Emperor. The Emperor's power is massively stymied because it has power over the entire Empire. And the Cult of Sigmar is dominant there. And whilst we might have a Theogenist of Kislev, and we do, and he is grounded in Kislev city, although work often found in Altdorf, he has pretty much zero influence. He's over in Kislev, literally zero influence. There's barely a Temple of Sigmar over there that he could say, ha, thank goodness for that big Temple of Sigmar. There is one in Kislev city. There is a couple of them, particularly along the borderlands, and some of the largest Sinista down there. But yeah, Sigmar has pretty much no influence at all.
Diamond, if you want a real world example of how words can seem related but aren't, Vizier and Advisor mean basically the same thing and look like they could be related. Vizier, Advisor, however, they aren't. Completely separate origins.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a lovely discussion of how words can often look like they are definitely related, but when you look into them, you realize that etymologically they've come from entirely different places. And I love that. I'm a big wordy buff. We even have our own little word channel over on the LAWhammer Discord purely because words are cool. And where they come from can often tell an incredibly interesting linguistic history.
Good old etymology. Christopher Clayton, me, a Pittsburgher, hearing the word pierogies, wakes up from a sudden nap. Yeah.
Pierogi time. I need to go get myself some pierogies. They sound like they're super tasty.
Yeah. Psych. So which city is a representation of Yugoslavia, given that was still a country back when Warhammer popped up?
So Yugoslavia, the entirety of the Balkans, in fact, are summed up by the Border Princes down in the south of the Old World. And the Border Princes, in some respects, are an early attempt to say that the Balkan area is difficult to pin down because it's constantly arguing and new states are forming, and that's to this day still going. North Macedonia, for example, being called North Macedonia. Yugoslavia, in the attempt to pull Yugoslavia together as one group while all the internal peoples might have perhaps preferred it to be different. It's summed up with the Border Princes, and I think the Border Princes have been, broadly speaking, vastly underserved, underwritten, and badly put together pretty much from their outset.
Mm-hmm. Let's look, Chris. With the Siege of Prague being a major event during the time of the Old World, what would you like to see? What would you like to see GW expanded on it, or where did they mess it up? No, I mean the Siege of Prague should literally be one of the most climactic moments of the Old World as a setting.
Damn straight. I don't care if they mess it up. It's just more lore. It's just more stuff.
Listen, we've been in the Warhammer game for a long time. They're inevitably going to fuck stuff up. That's fine. We'll just take the bits we like.
Yeah, totally. And we'll love the bits we like, and the bits we don't like, we'll start saying this is shit. And then after about half a year, we'll go, well, this is just the new norm. And we'll start using that.
I would rather them try and fail than not try at all. I'll put it that way.
I just go, hey, hello. I'm glad to hear that you're from North Macedonia. I can't say it's a mess. Oh dear. The politics in that part of the world are often febrile. They're often difficult, and sometimes the impositions from outside are significant.
Ratwood, yes. The vampires should 100% be involved in the Siege of Prague because they're also fucked if the city goes down.
Yeah, it's, I think, a core component of how that city is comprised. But we are talking some time before. So there would be a different political setup with the vampires expressing slightly different ways. But I've got a feeling they won't even touch that.
Yeah, I hope they do. But considering they're currently a legacy race, we'll wait and see what happens. GW needs sense. Yeah, they probably should. They're never going to because they'd have to pay somebody. But it'd be nice if they did.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. When we were writing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, I asked, and we couldn't get one, for a host of bits and pieces. So I ended up falling back on people that I knew, fans that I was aware of, because I've been working in the Warhammer community now for quite a long time. So we got quite a lot of people to check over certain parts of it, particularly when it came to the gods, which everyone thinks is generally going to be an easy thing. But the gods of Warhammer are not as gendered in the way that you'd expect. Some real
There's so many of them.
And they are complicated. And we were quite keen to avoid much of the language that had been used previously. So we popped out to a bunch of sensitivity readers, and that was not just beneficial, it was massively so, because we even had a nice little aside explaining how the gods can manifest in different ways. And one of our sensitivity readers came back with, you've attempted to effectively say that some of the gods are non-binary, and you haven't. What you've done is you've said they're binary, and this is why. And we went, you're right, we fucked that one up. Because our intent was to say that some gods are just perceived in different ways in different places. Ronald, for example, in some places is seen as a woman, in other places as a man, in some places as an animal. And we just completely messed up our language in regards to that. So a quick rewrite there, and it came out much more smoothly, and I much preferred the one that we ended up on. And Lindsay reached out to a bunch of Facebook groups. That's my wife, because she was responsible for some of the writing, and she was writing some of the introductory parts for the gods. And she got them all NDA'd up, get a non-disclosure agreement, and they did a bunch of sensitivity readings on the god stuff that she was working on. But often you'll find that it just doesn't happen on Games Workshop side. They just write internally, and then the fans later say, I think you've messed up.
Yeah. Speaking of sensitivity stuff, everyone mentions Pygmies thing, best of the past. Everyone brings up Nipponese narrative car companies. Well, that is dumb and stupid, but that is also a lot easier to change because you're just changing names as opposed to a big history of like released miniatures.
Yeah. When you name a god after your car, you know you're in a bad place. Orange Simca. Okay, and Simca is Vimptoism. Vimpto is a fruit drink here in the UK. Instead of Shinto, it was Vimpto. And it's just stupid. It's beyond stupid. The old Nippon stuff is just proliferated with what is, the classic Warhammer pun, but it's not well deployed. And it pretty much closed the doors to opening up markets in that area because they could never use that shit. Because people would be up in arms in the same way that, say, for example, if you just started renaming Catholic stuff as Catholic things and just made it all a joke, Catholic people would be upset over here. And they didn't do that, strangely enough. They, of course, have Catholic influences in terms of how, for example, the cult of Sigmar is often expressed as relatively heavy with Catholic influences. But it's not offensive, unlike the other options for Nippon.
Yeah, but luckily, that mostly just requires, new writing, which is a lot easier. Psych, given the Czech beer is the best in Europe, is Kislevite the best human beer? I feel like that's immediately spawned an argument.
Particularly given that Czechoslovakia, as it was back when it was being written, and then Czech and Slovakia, as it was later, are actually more firmly placed into places like Ostermark and Ostland in terms of their influences of the writing that goes on it. You'll find many of the Ostland names have got Polish roots, for example, which you might expect to find over on the opposite side of the border in Kislev. If you look at how these things are normally named, there's some deeply Polish names all the way through Ostland. And in south of Ostland, northern Ostermark, there's a bunch that are super Czech. So it's not an easy copy-paste over into Kislev argument here. There's lots of influences across the east of the empire and into Kislev, into real-world places, I suppose.
Yep. And with that, we need to wrap up. We're over time.
We do. We're over time. So I'm going to give a quick... I destroyed my PC down there by mistake and just knocked the piece over. I'm going to give a quick summary. My quick summary in this one is it's going to be quick because Prague stands as the bastion of the north for the old world. Now, the old world includes Norska, obviously, but Norska, unlike its original iteration where they were just fantasy Vikings, turned into fantasy chaos worshippers, and then fantasy chaos worshippers and Vikings, and then fantasy chaos worshippers, Vikings, but sometimes they were themselves, and but they sort of got removed from the old world model of the great cities of the north, and Kislev is what is left. And the great bastion of the north in Warhammer was sacked was absolutely leveled by chaos 200 years ago, and the impact of that is felt into its modern iteration, where the city is riddled through with tainted corruption. And whilst there is, pardon me, a stubborn need from not just the Ungals, but the Kislevites and the old world as a whole to maintain this city, it is almost certainly to the detriment of the North, because it's that corruption that probably allows for Kislev to fall at a later date, because it's riddled through with chaos cultists as well. And those chaos cultists open gates, cause problems, and the corruption that they are pretty much laced through with just reinforces that. I'm going to argue that the biggest thing about Prague is that it's a mistake. It should have been closed. And the reason that it wasn't is because it's an old hammer city, where that corruption didn't matter in the earlier versions to the same degree it did later. When Warhammer dialed everything up to 11, later writers had to keep on going, well, how do I justify Prague? How can it even exist given how tainted it was? They'd burn it to the ground and never look back. It shouldn't exist. And the fact that it does, I think, is a beautiful story. And I don't say the writers should have burned it down and never allowed it. I'm saying that in the real Warhammer world, they should have, but they didn't. And that is a brilliant story, because we have got a city of chaos. We've got a city at war with itself that is filled with horror and terror and the most stubborn folk that the old world has to offer, refusing to move on and doggedly fighting on to cleanse the place. And they almost certainly would have if they'd been given the time. It's also a city that not only is full of adventure because of these conflicts, but has a god literally living beneath it. It's not the only city in the Warhammer world to have this, but it's certainly an interesting one nonetheless, and a god that harks all the way back to almost ancient, forgotten, and not really Games Workshop facing lore, if you want to view it with such things, because they don't, strictly speaking, fully own the IP to Arianka, which they later renamed, as we just said near the beginning of the stream. But it's a place that is just waiting for exciting adventure, whether it's trying to free old gods that are anti-chaos, whether it's trying to rebuild walls, as we discussed earlier, as dwarves try to stop you before a chaos horde arrives, whether it's a retelling of the invasion of Arik Demonclaw and Gotrek and Felix and everything that they were doing inside Prague, whether it's just looking at the realms of the Ice Queen, using that version of Kislev, whether it's going all the way back to the Something Rotten in Kislev version and going for the far more spiritual, weird version of Kislev that it offers, or whether you go for the total war version, which has got the grand orthodoxy running through this city just like any others. It creates a fascinating playground where we get cultures from across the world trading in a massive trade hub that's tainted and controlled in secret by vampires. It's too cool. It's a great place. I love it. And I really wouldn't mind an entire book on Prague.
Yeah, that would be super duper nice. And I'll leave us with the most totally important note, which is that in the end times, it falls off screen to Echoed Hellbrass and his legions, who only then gets kicked out by Throg the Troll King, who sets up shop in Prague for like 2 to 3 years until he finally gets kicked out by Gotrek and Felix.
Yeah, go figure. It's a bullshit line. It didn't tell any of the stories of Prague. It should have been about the internal divisions of all the groups fragmenting as the external force eventually takes it. And
no, it was just hey, we've been here before for Gotrek and Felix.
Totally.
Hammond, so sensitivity readers double check things. That's
nice
a good one,
Hammond. That's a good way to end it.
All right, thank you all very, very much for watching. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with us. Just a reminder that this Wednesday we will be doing the second birthday Sotek thing.
We are.
we'll be building a chaos god, which should be a good time. And next Sunday, I'm kind of still tempted by that stupid how do people date other cults. I feel like we should do something Valentine's themed. I don't know.
I'll have to think about it. Discuss it after. We'll have an idea.
But that is pretty much it for us today. We hope you all had a wonderful time. If you have
no, you go first.
If you haven't heard, LAWhammer is back on. and doing stuff. So make sure that you are showing up on Fridays at 1 p.m. CST, 7 p.m. BST.
Oh, next episode's going to be awesome.
The next one's gonna be, the last one was fantastic. I caught, I think, like 80% of it. But it was super duper good. Fucking Skaven Doom Train fucking thing. Great. A lot of really great shit going on. Also, like one of the best Skaven slave characters that's been introduced. A really fun one. Should be a really good time. And then Rookery is also back. Inside the Rookery is back. I assume y'all are on for this week.
We are indeed. This Saturday, we are speaking to someone. It's a role-playing stream. That's all I recall. I'll be posting a poster up for that, I think, on Monday. I'm also doing a masterclass for people who want the easiest way of doing PC-led GMing, something that most people think GMing is hard. I think it's easy. I'm going to be giving one of my biggest hacks to the patrons over on the Inside the Rookery side on Tuesday. That'll be at 7 p.m. on Tuesday. It's going to be super cool. And of course, do buy Dark Deeds.
Yes, which of course, Praag is full of Dark Deeds.
It is indeed full of Dark Deeds. And I'd also like to say thank you all so much for putting up with me being extremely wasted today. I was a bit...
honestly,
we got through. It was good.
You can't really tell. It makes you feel better.
Yeah, thanks for saying so. So thank you all so much for putting up with me.
Yeah. All right, we're heading off, and we will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.